Eleanor Whitaker dropped her carpetbag in the dust, pulled a fistful of rotting beef from the smokehouse, and threw it at the boots of the man who'd promised to marry her. "This," she said, "is why your men are starving." Caleb Rourke had asked for a wife who could work. He got a woman who saw everything he'd ruined. If you love stories where a woman the world threw away rises up and saves the very men who doubted her, subscribe, and stay with me to the very end. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The wagon that brought Eleanor Whitaker up the mountain didn't wait to see if she'd be welcome. The driver, a hunched man from the valley station named Pruitt, had said maybe 6 words the entire climb, and the last 2 were, "There, Rourke's." He'd tipped his chin toward a cluster of gray buildings, clinging to a shelf of land below the timberline, and then he'd reined the mules to a halt a good 40 paces short of the yard, as though the ground itself might be catching. "This ain't the house," Eleanor said. "Close as I go." Pruitt spat. "Man up there don't pay for me to get my wheels dirty. You want the door, you walk it." So she walked it. She climbed down without help because none was offered, and she reached back into the wagon bed for her things, one carpetbag worn soft at the corners and one wooden crate bound with rope her mother had knotted a decade before her mother had died. The crate was heavy. Eleanor was not a large woman. She got her arms around it anyway and set it on her hip, and did not look back when Pruitt clucked to the mules, and the wagon groaned away downhill, leaving her alone in the burning afternoon with the smell of the place already in her nose. And what a smell it was! She'd been raised near stockyards. She knew the honest reek of animals, of manure and hide and tallow, and none of that troubled her. This was different. This was the sweetish, thick, curdled stink of meat gone wrong, of food that had been good once and had been allowed to turn. It hung over the whole yard like a low ceiling. It got worse as she came closer to the long shed with the crooked chimney, and worse still when she passed a water trough green at the edges, and by the time she stood at the center of the yard she understood before she'd met a single soul that something up here was dying. Men noticed her before she reached them. They came out of the shade the way cattle drift toward a fence, slow sidelong, pretending not to. 2 from the barn, 3 from the bunkhouse porch, one of them still chewing. A tall boy no older than 17 straightened up from a broken drying rack with a hammer forgotten in his hand. She counted without meaning to. It was a habit from her father's ledgers counting. By the time she stopped, she'd reached 19 men, and she could hear more inside. 19 men, and not one of them looked fed. Their shirts hung off them. Their faces had that scraped-down look she knew too well from the last bad winter her own family had known before the trading company failed and her father went to the ground with it. These were working men, big-handed, sun-scorched, and they were hungry. She could see it. Hungry men have a particular stillness. They watch food, and they watch anything new because new might mean change, and change might mean supper. "You lost, ma'am," one of them called. Older, gray in the beard, a voice like a rock rolled downhill. He'd stepped out ahead of the others, and the way the rest of them shifted told her he was the one they listened to when the boss wasn't near. "No," Eleanor said. "I'm found. Is Mr. Rourke here?" The old man's eyes went to her crate, then to her bag, then to her face, and something in them cooled. "You're her," he said. It wasn't a question. The one he sent off for. "I'm Eleanor Whitaker." A ripple went through them then. A couple of the younger ones exchanged a look. The chewing man stopped chewing, and the old one, Amos, though she didn't know his name yet, took off his hat, which surprised her because it wasn't a gesture of respect. It was more like a man baring his head at a graveside. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I don't reckon you know what you walked into." "Then tell me." "That ain't my place." "Whose is it?" And that was when the barn door banged open and Caleb Rourke came out into the light. She knew him at once, though she'd never seen his face. She knew him because every man in the yard turned toward him at the same instant, the way iron filings turn to a magnet, and because he moved like a man who owned the ground and hated it. He was tall. He was broad through the shoulders in the way of men who'd spent their lives lifting things that fought back. His sleeves were rolled and his forearms were dark as saddle leather, and there was a hardness set into his face that had nothing to do with the sun. He was maybe 10 years older than her. He looked older than that. Grief does that to a man, adds years he never lived. He stopped 6 feet from her. He did not take off his hat. "You're late," he said. Eleanor set her crate down in the dust. Slow, careful. She straightened her back. "The wagon came when it came," she said. "I don't drive the mules." "I sent word for the 12th. And I left on the 10th, Mr. Rourke, and the river was up at the Broken Fork crossing, and I sat 2 days on the wrong bank with a preacher's widow and a crate of chickens waiting for the water to drop. If you'd like to blame someone, I'd suggest the river." Somebody among the men made a sound that might have been a laugh strangled in its cradle. Caleb's jaw moved. "That your crate?" he said. "It is. What's in it?" "My things. A woman comes to run a house," he said, "brings a trunk of dresses and a hope chest and a picture of her mother. That's the size of a trunk, that's the size of a chest." He nodded at the crate. "That's the size of a coffin. So I'll ask again, what's in it?" The yard had gone very quiet. Even the wind up in the timber had dropped, and the only sound was a fly working the edge of the green trough. Eleanor looked at him a long moment. "You wrote for a wife who could work," she said. "You didn't write for a wife who could dance. So no, Mr. Rourke, I didn't bring dresses." "Then what?" "Everything you're too proud to ask a woman for." She saw it land. She saw the flinch of it behind his eyes. Not shame. Not yet, he was too far gone. In his pride for shame, but recognition, the way a man flinches when a stranger says his own secret out loud. He covered it fast. He always would. She'd learned that about him. He covered it the way he covered everything, with more hardness. "I asked for a wife who could work," Caleb said loud enough for the men to hear, "not another mouth to feed." And there it was, 19 hungry men, 1 dying ranch, and this man had just told her in front of all of them that she was a burden before she'd unpacked a single thing. Eleanor didn't cry. She wanted to. Somewhere far down under her ribs, there was a girl who'd been passed hand to hand since her family fell. A girl who'd been called a charity case and a spinster and a millstone. A girl who had gotten on that wagon, telling herself that this time, this far away, this high up a mountain, maybe there'd be a man who saw more than a mouth. That girl wanted to sit down in the dust and weep, but Eleanor Whitaker had buried that girl a long time ago, and she'd learned that the only answer hard men respected was a harder truth. So she turned her back on him. She turned her whole body away from Caleb Rourke mid-conversation in front of all his men, and she walked to the smokehouse. She'd marked it the moment she arrived, the source of the worst of the smell, the long shed with the crooked chimney and the door hanging open on a bent hinge. She walked to it, and she stepped inside, where the stink was so thick it wet the back of her throat, and she came out 3 seconds later with a fistful of beef that had been hung to cure and had instead gone to slime gray-green and dripping, and she crossed back to Caleb Rourke, and she threw it down at his boots. It hit the dust with a sound like a slap. "That," she said, "is why your men are starving." Nobody moved. Caleb looked down at the ruined meat sitting across the toe of his boot. When he looked back up, his eyes had gone flat and dangerous, and a younger woman, a softer woman, would have stepped back from that look. Eleanor stepped forward. "You've got a smokehouse full of meat you can't sell and can't eat," she said. And now she wasn't loud. Now she was quiet, and the quiet carried farther than shouting. "You've got a curing shed, built with the vents facing the afternoon sun, so it bakes instead of smokes. You've got a salt barrel, I can smell it from here, that somebody let get wet, and wet salt won't draw, so every cut you've packed since has rotted from the middle out. You've got a trough gone to algae because nobody's scrubbed it, and men drinking off it, and you wonder why half of them look sick." She took a breath. "I've been on your land 11 minutes, Mr. Rourke. That's what I found in 11 minutes. You want to tell me again which one of us is a wasted mouth?" The silence stretched so long it hurt. Then from over by the bunkhouse, the old gray-bearded one, Amos, said very softly to nobody in particular, "Salt barrel got reined in back in May." Caleb's head turned. "That's enough, Amos." Just saying the lady ain't wrong about the salt. I said that's enough, but it wasn't enough. And every man in the yard knew. It wasn't because she'd said out loud the thing they'd all been thinking, and none of them had the standing to say. Their boss had married a stranger sight unseen to save a place that was drowning, and the stranger had walked in and named the ways it was drowning faster than he ever had. You could see it moving through them. You could see the way they looked at her, change just slightly, just at the edges. The tall boy with the hammer, the chewing man who'd stopped chewing all of them recalculating. Caleb saw it too. That was the worst of it for him. He saw his own men, his hungry men, looking at her. "Come with me," he said to Eleanor, and turned on his heel. She didn't move. "My crate," she said. He stopped, turned back. "What?" "I'll come with you," Eleanor said. "When someone carries my crate somewhere, it won't sit in the sun. There's things in it that don't like heat. If your intention is to talk to me privately about how unwelcome I am, Mr. Rourke, I'd rather do it knowing my mother's journals aren't cooking on the ground behind me." For a moment, she thought he'd refuse. For a moment, she thought he'd tell her to carry it herself, or leave it, or get back on a wagon that had already gone. Then the tall boy, his name was Wesley. She'd learned 16 and an orphan, and the youngest hand on the place set down his hammer and stepped forward and picked up the crate without being told, grunting at the weight, and said, "Where you want it, ma'am?" "Somewhere shaded and dry, off the ground." "Thank you." She looked at him properly, the first person all day she'd looked at soft. "What's your name?" "Wesley, ma'am." "Thank you, Wesley." And Caleb Rourke stood there watching the youngest man on his ranch obey a woman he'd just called a burden, and something in his face that had been merely hard began very slightly to crack. He took her, not to the house but to the barn, into a corner near the tack where the horses could hear them and the men could not. "You made me look a fool out there," he said. "You did that yourself. I only stood nearby while you finished." "Woman?" "My name is Eleanor. Or Miss Whitaker if the first is too familiar for a man who just proposed marriage to me by letter. But I answer to a name, Mr. Rourke, not to woman. And I've found the men worth knowing learn that fast." His hands opened and closed at his sides. She watched them. She'd learned to watch a man's hands. Her father's had shaken when the money ran out. The men who came to take the trading house had kept theirs loose and easy the whole time, and the loose, easy ones had frightened her more. Caleb Rourke's hands were the hands of a man who used them for work and had forgotten how to use them for anything else. They weren't the hands of a man who'd hit a woman. She'd learned to tell. That was worth knowing at least. "You don't know what it is up here," he said finally, and some of the hardness had gone out of it. He sounded tired instead. "You come from a town." "I come from a town that failed," Eleanor said. "I come from watching my father sell a chair a day to buy bread and then sell the table. The chairs went with, and then have nothing to sell, but me to the highest respectable bidder, which turned out to be a widower in Missouri who wanted a nurse he didn't have to pay, and when I wouldn't take him, my own uncle called me ungrateful." She kept her voice even. "So when your letter came, Mr. Rourke asking for a woman who could work, who knew food and figures and physics, who wouldn't mind hardship, I read it a dozen times. Because in a whole stack of letters begging me to be somebody's unpaid nurse or unpaid mother or unpaid comfort, yours was the only one that asked what I could do instead of what I could give up." She paused. "And then I got here, and you told your men I was a mouth. So you'll forgive me if I'm disappointed, sir. I'd built you up in my head as a man who valued work. Turns out you just wanted the work done quiet." Caleb was quiet a long moment. "How'd you know about the vents?" he said. It wasn't the question she'd expected. It caught her off guard, and she answered it plain. "My mother cured meat for a living after my father's first failure, before the trading house. We had a smokehouse behind the shop for 11 years, and she ran it, and she taught me everything, because she said, a woman who can preserve food will never fully starve, and never be fully worthless, and both of those were things she'd been, and she didn't want them for me." Eleanor looked at the dust on the barn floor. "Vents face north and east if you can help it, never west. West's son turns a smokehouse into an oven. Come afternoon, and cooked meat with no smoke through it is just meat left out to spoil slow. Yours face west, and a little south. Whoever built it for a cold country. This isn't a cold country in July. My father built it, Caleb said, for a cold country. We came down from Minnesota. Then your father built well for Minnesota, and you've been paying for Montana ever since. Something moved across his face. She'd said the wrong thing and the right thing at once. She'd insulted the dead and told the truth, and she watched him decide which one to be angry about, and watched him, to his credit, choose neither. He's gone, Caleb said. 4 years. I'm sorry. Don't be. He was a hard man. A pause. So am I. You'll have gathered. I'd gathered. They stood in the barn dark with the horses shifting behind them, and Eleanor understood that they had arrived at the true center of the thing. The reason he'd married a stranger, and the reason he'd insulted her the moment she stepped down. And it was all the same reason. This was a man who had watched everything he loved either die or leave, and had decided that the only safe way to live was to need nothing and let no one close. And he had gotten so good at it that he'd nearly killed a ranch and 22 men rather than admit out loud that he needed help. How many men do you feed? She said. 22. Was 26 in the spring. 4 left. Because they were hungry. Because they weren't paid, he said. And there it was, the second secret dropping out of him, almost against his will. Beef prices are set by the man who buys. I sell to Silas Vane, and Vane pays what Vane pays, and it's gone down every quarter for 2 years, and I can't drive to another market, because there isn't another market, not one a man on this mountain can reach with cattle before they lose weight walking. So I sell low, and I owe. And the men eat what's left after the note's paid, which lately is spoiled beef and beans, and now you know the whole of it, Miss Whitaker, and I'll thank you not to say it in the yard. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Silas Vane, she said. The cattle buyer. You know him. I know the type. My father dealt with a dozen Silas Vanes. A man who owns the only road always tries to own the men who use it. She looked up at him. But you're not selling him cattle, Mr. Rourke. Not only cattle, or you wouldn't have a smokehouse full of ruined beef. His eyes narrowed. How do you? Because a man who only sold cattle wouldn't cure beef at all. He'd sell the animal on the hoof and be done. You're curing beef because at some point you tried to sell preserved meat direct to somebody somewhere and cut Vane out of it. And it failed. It failed because your smokehouse cooks instead of smokes, and your salt got wet so every batch rotted, and you kept trying, and kept failing, and kept losing salt and beef and time, and every failed batch is money you didn't have, and that's the real hole this ranch is bleeding out of. Not the low prices, the failed cure. She watched his face. How close am I? Caleb Rourke did not answer for a long, long time. When he did, his voice had changed entirely. The hardness was still there, but under it was something raw, something she recognized, because she'd carried it herself for years. Mining camps, he said. Up at Deer Lodge and the new diggings past it. Thousands of men and no ranch near enough to feed them fresh, so they pay dear for preserved. Twice what Vane gives me. 3 times. Dur. He swallowed. I figured it out 2 years ago. I figured if I could get preserved beef up to the camps I could pay my men and clear my note and tell Vane to go to hell. And I've tried. God knows I've tried. And every batch I've cured has gone green in the barrel, and I've had to bury it. And I've watched better men than me shake their heads and leave, and I couldn't figure out why. I'm not a stupid man, Miss Whitaker. I run 400 head over country that'd break most men. But I couldn't cure a barrel of beef to save this place, and it's killing me. And I sent off for a wife because a wife was cheaper than a foreman. And I told myself she could at least keep the men fed while I figured it out. And instead, Eleanor said gently, she walked in and told you why in 11 minutes. He looked away. Yeah, he said. She did. There was a long silence. Outside, faintly, they could hear the men in the yard, the ordinary sounds of a ranch trying to stay alive. A hammer, a horse, a voice calling another voice. "I can fix your smokehouse," Eleanor said. Caleb's head came up. "I can fix the vents. I can dry the salt or get you salt that isn't ruined. I can teach your cook to store what you've got so it stops spoiling before it even reaches the barrel. I can build you drying racks that work and a fire pit that smokes cool instead of hot. And if the beef is good and the cure is right, Mr. Rourke, I can put up preserved meat that'll ride to Deer Lodge in July and arrive worth 3 times what Silas Vane pays you." She let that sit. "I can do all of it. I've done all of it. I did it beside my mother for 11 years, and I've done it alone since she died. It is the one thing in this world I know I'm good at, and it is the reason I got on that wagon." "Why?" Caleb said. "Just that. Why?" And Eleanor understood the question under the question. He wasn't asking why she could. He was asking why she would. Why a woman he'd insulted the moment she arrived would offer to save the very man who'd shamed her in front of his men in the dust of his own yard. "Because I don't have anywhere else," she said, and for the first time all day her voice was not quite steady. "That's the plain truth, and I won't dress it up for you. Everyone else who wanted me to disappear into their house and be quiet and be grateful. You wanted somebody who could do a thing. I can do the thing. And if I do it well enough, then maybe for once in my life I'll be somewhere I'm not a mouth or a millstone or a charity, but a person who's here because she's worth having here." She lifted her chin. "So that's my terms, Mr. Rourke. I'll marry you, like the letter said, and I'll run your house, and I'll save your smokehouse. But not as a favor, and not as a wife who's grateful you took her in. As a partner in a business that's going to work. You'll answer to me on the curing the way your men answer to you on the cattle. That's my price. Take it or send me down the mountain, but decide now, because I've had a long ride and I'd like to know before dark whether I'm staying." The horses shifted. A fly buzzed. Somewhere, the hammer struck twice and stopped. Caleb Rourke looked at this woman, this small dust-covered, sharp-tongued stranger who'd thrown rotten meat at his feet, and named every failure of his life inside of half an hour. And Eleanor watched him war with himself. Watched the pride in him rear up one last time against the plain arithmetic of a dying ranch and a woman who knew how to save it. Pride lost. "Amos," he called. The old man appeared in the barn door so fast he'd plainly been listening. "Boss?" "Ride down to the valley in the morning. I want every sack of dry salt you can buy on credit, and I want it up here by tomorrow night." Amos looked from Caleb to Eleanor and back again, and something eased in his weathered face, something that might have been relief he'd given up hoping to feel. "How much credit we got left?" "Get the salt," Caleb said. "I'll worry about the credit." "Yes, boss." But the old man didn't leave. He stood a moment longer, and then he did the thing Eleanor didn't expect. He touched the brim of his hat to her, not bearing it like a graveside, tipping it, like a man to a person he'd decided to reckon with. "Ma'am," he said, "for what it's worth, the salt barrel was my fault. Left the lid off in the rain. Been eating myself over it since May, watching the batches go bad and not knowing if it was me." His jaw worked. "You knew what it was the second you smelled it." "Wet salt has a smell," Eleanor said more gently than she'd said anything all day. "It's not your fault you didn't know it. Nobody taught you. My mother taught me. That's the only difference between us. Mr. Reed, somebody taught me." Amos looked at her a moment longer, then nodded once and went out to see about the salt. That left the two of them again in the barn dark. "You'll want the house," Caleb said gruffly. It's not much. I keep the far room. There's a room off the kitchen was my mother's. Wesley'll bring your crate up." "Thank you. And Miss Whitaker." He'd started to leave and he stopped, his back half turned, and she saw what it cost him to say. The next part saw it in the set of his shoulders. "What I said, in the yard, about a mouth to feed." He didn't turn around. He couldn't quite. "I was wrong. I've been wrong about a good deal up here, and too proud to hear it, and I reckon a man who's watched everything he built go green in a barrel doesn't have much call to be proud. Now he turned, and the flat, dangerous look was gone, and what was underneath it was just a tired man on a mountain who was out of ideas and had just been handed one. You saw the truth of this place faster than I've let myself see it in 2 years. I don't know what to make of you, but I'll not call you a mouth again. It wasn't a soft thing to say. It wasn't tender. There was no warmth in it, and no promise, and certainly nothing a girl dreams of hearing from the man she's crossed a territory to marry. But it was true. And Eleanor Whitaker had learned to live on true, the way other people lived on bread. "That'll do, Mr. Rourke," she said. "That'll do for a start." She unpacked her crate that evening in the small room off the kitchen that had been his mother's, with Wesley carrying it up and setting it down where she pointed, and then lingering in the doorway, curious as a colt. "That really your mama's stuff, ma'am?" "It is." "What's in it?" Eleanor untied the rope her mother had knotted 11 years before and lifted the lid, and the boy leaned in to look, and so did she, though she knew every item by heart. There were the journals, 6 of them bound in oilcloth, filled cover to cover in her mother's cramped hand, with the record of 11 years of curing, which cuts took salt best, and which took smoke. How long each hung, what the weather did to a batch, and what to do about the weather. There were the smoke charts drawn careful as maps showing how cool smoke moved, and how to make a fire that gave smoke without heat. There were the tools, the hooks, the thermometer she'd carried wrapped in 3 shirts so it wouldn't break the little brass scale for weighing salt against meat. And there were the supply maps, her mother's, and then her own, showing the routes and the seasons where salt was cheap and where preserved meat sold dear. "That's a whole lot of paper," Wesley said doubtfully. Eleanor lifted out the topmost journal and held it a moment, and her thumb found the worn place on the cover where her mother's thumb had worn it first. "This," she said quietly, "is going to save this ranch. This is going to feed you, Wesley, and pay you and every man out there who thinks a crate of paper can't do the work of a man." She set it down with great care. "My mother used to say the difference between a family that eats through the winter and a family that starves isn't luck, and it isn't even work. It's knowing. Just knowing the right way to do the right thing at the right time. Most folks never learn it, and they call the ones who do lucky." She looked at the boy. "There's no luck in it, Wesley. There's just knowing. And now I'm up here and I know, and I mean to teach it to every one of you until this mountain runs on it." Down the hall unheard, Caleb Rourke had come to the kitchen for water, and stopped at the sound of her voice, and stood in the dark, with the dipper in his hand, listening to a woman he'd insulted at noon tell his youngest hand that she was going to save them all. He didn't go in. He didn't say anything, but he stood there a long time in the dark, and for the first time in 4 years, Caleb Rourke felt something in his chest. He'd forgotten the name of something that had died with his father in the cold room down the hall, and that he'd sworn he'd never feel again, because feeling it had only ever cost him. It was hope. He drank his water and went to bed and did not sleep, and the smell of rot still hung over the yard, but somewhere in the small room off the kitchen, a lamp burned late over 6 oilcloth journals, and a woman the whole world had called a burden read her mother's hand by candlelight and made her plans, and up the dark mountain the summer wind finally turned, and for the first time in a long time it came from the north. The salt came up the mountain the next night on 2 mules and a borrowed cart, and Amos Reed came with it looking 10 years older than he had that morning because he'd spent the whole day being told no. "Half of what you asked for," he said, dropping the sacks in the yard while the men gathered round. "That's all the credit we got left down there, boss. Hendricks at the Mercantile looked at me like I'd asked to borrow his wife. Said the Rourke account stretched thin as a widow's Sunday dress." He wiped his face. "He knew things he shouldn't, too. Knew what beef prices you've been getting. Knew about the note. Knew a woman come up here yesterday." Caleb's head came up slow. "How'd he know that?" "Didn't say. But there's only one man in this valley makes it his business to know what happens on your land before you know it yourself, and it ain't me." Amos looked at him steady. Silas Vane was in that store this morning, boss. Bought nothing. Just stood by the counter while I begged for salt on credit and watched me do it and smiled the whole time. The men had gone quiet. Eleanor came out onto the kitchen step, then drying her hands on an apron that had been Caleb's mother's, and she'd heard the last of it, and she crossed the yard and looked at the salt sacks and pressed her thumb into the seam of the nearest one and brought it to her nose and said, "This is good. This is dry. Half is enough to start." Then she straightened. "Mr. Reed, when you were begging in that store, did Silas Vane hear you say my name?" Amos frowned. "Reckon he heard your name, ma'am. Hendricks said it. Said the new woman up at Rourke's." "Did he hear what I do?" "No, ma'am. Nobody down there knows what you do. Half of 'em think Caleb married himself a cook." "Good," Eleanor said. "Keep it that way. Every day Silas Vane thinks Mr. Rourke married a cook is a day we're not being watched." She looked at Caleb. "He'll find out. Men like him always find out. But the longer he thinks this ranch is exactly as dead as it was last week, the more time we've got before he does something about it. So nobody talks in the valley, not one man. Am I understood?" She'd said it to the whole yard, 22 hungry men and their boss, a woman a day off the wagon giving an order, and for a moment the thing hung there wrong, and she saw 2 or 3 of the older hands stiffen at being told their business by a stranger in a skirt. Then Caleb said, "You heard her," and it settled. But it settled uneasy, and Eleanor knew it, and she knew she couldn't run a smokehouse on borrowed authority from a man. The men were half sick of anyway. She'd have to earn her own. So that night she didn't sleep. She sat up over the journals with a stub of pencil and Caleb's ledger. She'd asked for it, and he'd handed it over without a word, which told her more about how far gone he was than anything he'd said, because a proud man doesn't give a stranger his books unless he's stopped believing the numbers can get worse. They could get worse. She found that out by lamplight. She found the note first, $380 owed to the Bitterroot Cattle and Land Company, which she did not know yet was Silas Vane by another name, due in full at the end of September, secured against the ranch itself. She found the beef prices quarter by quarter marching down the page like a man walking into his own grave. She found the count of head 411 in the spring, 390 now, 21 lost to a screwworm outbreak he hadn't had the salve to treat. And she found near the back, in Caleb's own cramped and furious hand, a single line that wasn't a number at all. Buried 3rd batch, May 30th. Won't tell the men how much salt that cost. She sat with that a long while. Then she took a fresh page and she began to build the thing that would save them, cut by cut and pound by pound and dollar by dollar. And when she finally blew out the lamp, the window was already going gray and she'd slept none at all, and she'd never in her life felt more awake. Work started before dawn, and it started with the smokehouse. "Everybody thinks the fix is the fire," she told the 6 men Caleb had put under her Wesley and Amos, and 4 others, the ones who could be spared from the cattle. "It isn't the fire. The fire's the last thing. If you fix the fire first, you just cook the meat faster." She had them tearing at the west wall where the vents were. "The fix is the air. Smoke's got to move. Slow and cool and steady, floor to roof in one side and out the other, and it's got to come off a fire that's more smoke than flame. Right now your smoke sits in here and stews because there's nowhere for it to go, and the sun bakes the whole box by noon. We're going to change where the air comes in. Been smoking meat in that house 9 years, said one of the men. A thick-necked hand named Duff, who'd been on the place longest after Amos. He said it flat. Caleb's daddy built it. Caleb's daddy built it for Minnesota, Eleanor said, not stopping. You're not in Minnesota. Pull the west boards. New vents low on the north wall, high on the east. Wesley, you're small. You're going up on the roof to open the chimney draw. Duff didn't move. And if the boss's daddy knew something you don't, the other men slowed. Eleanor felt it the test. The second one, the men deciding whether a woman's knowing counted for anything against a dead man's building. She set down her pry bar. Mr. Duff, she said, how many batches has this ranch buried since spring? He didn't answer. 3, she said. I read it. 3 batches of good beef salt you paid for work you did, all of it green in the barrel, and dug into a hole. Caleb's daddy built this house 9 years ago, and for 2 of those years, it's buried everything you've put in it. So I'll ask you plain, and I'll only ask once. Do you want to keep honoring the way a dead man built it and bury the 4th batch come August? Or do you want to eat this winter? She picked the bar back up. Because I know which one I'm here for. You pull those boards, or you go help with the cattle, but you don't stand in my smokehouse telling me the sun rises in the west when I've watched it come up in the east same as you. For a moment nobody breathed. Then Amos, without a word, walked to the west wall and jammed his own bar under the top board, and heaved, and the nails shrieked, and let go, and the board came off, and light poured into that stinking dark shed for the first time in years. He didn't look at Duff. He just started on the next board. Duff stood a moment longer, then he spat and picked up a bar and joined him. Wesley up on the roof already called down through the chimney hole laughing. Sun comes up in the east, Duff, I can see it doing it right now. And one of the other men laughed, and then they were all working, and Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding because she'd won a wall. It wasn't the war, but it was a wall. Caleb watched the whole of it from the corral fence 100 feet off, not interfering, and when she came out at midday, sweat-soaked and gray with old ash, he crossed to her and said only, "Duff's the hardest of 'em. If you turn Duff, you turn the rest." "I didn't turn him. The buried batches turned him. I just said it out loud." "That's the whole trick, isn't it?" Caleb said. "Saying it out loud." And he looked at her a beat too long, and then looked away, and went back to his horses. And Eleanor stood there with her heart doing something she told it firmly to stop doing because she had a smokehouse to save, and no time at all for the way a hard man's voice went soft when he wasn't guarding it. The pantry was next, and the pantry was worse than the smokehouse. She'd sent the cook a one-armed old drover named Pettibone, who'd lost the arm to a rope and his cooking to despair into it at first light, with orders to bring her everything, and what he brought her made her sit down on the step and put her hand over her mouth. Weevils in the flour, rancid lard gone the color of a bruise, beans crawling, salt pork so far gone it had liquefied in the bottom of the barrel, coffee that was mostly chicory and dirt. "This is what you've been feeding 22 men, she said. "This is what there is," Pettibone said, and there was no defense in it, just a tired old man's shame. "I stopped being a cook 2 winters back, ma'am. Now I'm just a fellow who boils what don't kill us fastest. You want to be angry, but there ain't been nothin' in this pantry worth cookin' since the money went." Eleanor looked at him a long moment. Then she stood up. "I'm not angry at you, Mr. Pettibone," she said. "I'm angry that nobody taught you. Same as the salt. Same as all of it." She rolled her sleeves. "Half this you can't save. The lard's gone, the pork's gone, the beans have to be picked over by hand, and most tossed. But the flour we can salvage, you sift the weevils and dry toast what's left, and it'll keep. And there's a hindquarter in the smokehouse that isn't rotted through just the outside, and I can trim it back to good meat, and we can eat tonight. Tonight, Mr. Pettibone. Real food. When's the last time these men ate real food?" The old man's chin trembled, and he mastered it. "Fella don't forget the last good meal he cooked," he said. "Mine was March. Made a stew that meant something. Been ashamed of every pot since." "Then tonight you cook one that means something again," Eleanor said. "And I'll stand right beside you and we'll do it together, and tomorrow you'll do it yourself, and by the end of the month you'll be a cook again, and I'll have a dozen other fires to put out." She handed him a knife. "Start on those beans. Good ones in the pot, bad ones to the hogs. And Mr. Pettibone, thank you for bringing it all out where I could see it. Most men would have hidden the worst of it to save face. You didn't. That's worth more to me than a full pantry." The old cook looked down at the knife in his one hand. "Ain't nobody said thank you to me on this place in 2 years, ma'am," he said, and his voice cracked clean through the middle of it, and he turned away fast and busied himself with the beans, so she wouldn't see, and Eleanor pretended not to have seen, and something in the pantry that had been dead a long time flickered. They ate real food that night. It was only trimmed beef and salvaged beans and hard bread, but it was hot and it was clean, and there was salt in it, and enough to go round twice, and Eleanor stood at the back of the cookhouse and watched 22 men eat like men who'd forgotten they were allowed to, and she watched them go quiet. The way people go quiet over the first good meal after a long bad time, and she watched a few of the younger ones, Wesley among them, go back for thirds and get waved on generous by Pettibone, who was crying a little into the pot and telling everyone it was the smoke. Caleb ate at the head of the long table and said nothing, and cleaned his plate, and when it was done, stood and looked down the length of the table at his men. Fed for once properly fed, and then across the room at the woman who'd fed them, and he opened his mouth like he might say something, and the whole room waited to hear what the boss would say. And what he said was, "Whitaker cooked. You'll thank her or you'll thank Pettibone, I don't care which, but there's coffee in the pots, actually coffee, so somebody thank somebody." It was clumsy. It was the least graceful gratitude a man ever choked out. But the men laughed, and a few of them said, "Thank you, ma'am," rough and shy and old. Amos raised his cup to her from down the table, and Eleanor, who had been thanked by exactly one person in 2 years, until this week, had to look hard at the floor for a moment. Later, when the men had gone to the bunkhouse and Pettibone was scrubbing his pots and actually singing low and off-key, Caleb found her outside where she'd gone to stand in the dark alone. "You crying," he said, not unkind, just direct the way he was. "No. You are. I'm tired, Mr. Rourke, and there's ash in my eyes, and if you tell a soul, I'll salt your coffee." She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. "Nobody's called me useful in a long while. It sits strange is all, like a coat that used to fit." Caleb was quiet a moment. "It fits you fine," he said, and went inside before she could answer, and Eleanor stood in the dark and let herself just once, just for a minute, feel like she had come home. The first real batch went into the smokehouse 8 days later. 8 days of 14-hour work rebuilding the vents, hanging new racks Wesley had built to her drawing, drying the good salt, and mixing it to her mother's ratio, laying a fire pit outside the shed, so the smoke came in cool through a trench instead of blazing up under the meat. 8 days of teaching, because that was the part that mattered most, and the part Eleanor had understood from the start. It did no good to fix the thing herself if it broke again the day she took sick or died. So she taught. She taught Wesley the fire because he was young and careful and would tend it like a mother tends a colicky baby. She taught 2 of the older hands the salt. She taught Pettibone the storage. She wrote it all out in a plain hand and pinned the pages to the smokehouse wall so any man could read the doing of it, and she made them read it out loud back to her until they had it cold. "Why are you giving it all away?" Amos asked her once, watching her teach. "Man'd think a woman'd want to keep the knowin' to herself. Job security." "My mother said the same to me once," Eleanor said. "First smokehouse she worked before she had her own. She was the only one who knew the cure, and she thought that made her safe. Then she took a fever, and there was nobody to keep the fires, and the whole batch spoiled, and they blamed her and turned her out sick into the winter." She checked the fire trench with the back of her hand, feeling for the heat. "She near died of that, and when she got her own house, she taught everybody everything, and I asked her why, and she said, 'Nell, the only knowing worth having is the kind that doesn't die with you. Anything else is just hoarding.'" She looked up at the old man. "I'm not here to be the only one who can save this ranch, Mr. Reed. I'm here to make sure it can save itself. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference." Amos chewed on that a while. "You're a strange sort of woman, Miss Whitaker," he said finally. "So I've been told, usually not as a compliment." "Meant it as one," Amos said, and tipped his hat and went back to the salt. On the 8th day, they hung the first batch, 140 pounds of good beef trimmed and salted and ready for the cool smoke, and Eleanor lit the fire herself in the trench, small and smoky, and she stood in the smokehouse door and watched the pale smoke climb slow through the meat and out the new high vent, moving right, moving cool, moving the way it was supposed to move for the first time in the building's life, and she felt Caleb come up beside her. "That's how it's meant to look," she said quietly. "See how it drifts, not rushing, not pooling, just walking through, taking its time. Give it 4 days like that and you'll have meat that'll ride to Deer Lodge in August and come out the far end worth every mile. Caleb watched the smoke. 4 days, he said. 4 days. Then we wrap it, and we drive it up, and we sell it to the mining camp, and we find out if I'm worth the crate I came in. She said it light, but it wasn't light, and they both knew it. 4 days and a 50-mile drive, and a camp quartermaster's yes or no stood between this ranch and the grave. And if the camp won't buy, Caleb said, then I'm a fool and you married one and we start over. And Vane, Eleanor was quiet a moment. Vane's the part that scares me, Mr. Rourke. Not the cure. I know the cure. Vane's a man, and men are the one thing I can't fix with salt and smoke. She looked at him. He'll know by now what I'm doing. Amos couldn't buy that salt without it getting talked about. Vane will have heard there's a woman up here rebuilding a smokehouse, and a man like Vane doesn't have to be told twice what that means. It means the one ranch he's been bleeding is about to stop bleeding into his pocket and start selling around him. He won't like it. And he's got the whole valley in his hand, and we've got 140 pounds of beef and a 50-mile road that runs right past his front door. Caleb's jaw tightened. Let him try something. That's exactly what he wants you to say, Eleanor said sharply. He wants you angry. Angry men make mistakes, and mistakes give a man like Vane the law and the town both. You don't fight Silas Vane with your fists, Mr. Rourke. You fight him by getting one wagon of beef past him to that camp, and then another, until the whole valley knows Rourke beef feeds the diggings, and Vane's the man who couldn't stop it. You beat him by being alive. That's all. Just by being alive when he needs you dead. She turned back to the smoke. So we tend the fire, and we watch the road, and in 4 days we drive. They watched the fire in silence a while. Miss Whitaker, Caleb said. You keep saying we. Eleanor's hands went still. So I do, she said. When'd that start? She didn't answer right away. Then. I suppose when Duff picked up the pry bar, or when Pettibone sang, or when your men said thank you and meant it. She kept her eyes on the smoke. I came up here for a bargain, Mr. Rourke. Marry the man, save the smokehouse, be useful, stop being a millstone. That was the whole of it. I didn't come up here to care whether Wesley eats or whether Amos stops eating himself over the salt or whether you... She stopped. Whether I what? Whether you ever look at that smoke like you're looking at it now? Eleanor said quietly. Like a man who forgot he was allowed to hope for anything, remembering how. She made herself look away from him. That's not in the bargain. That's just happened. And I'd be obliged if you didn't make me talk about it because I don't rightly know what to do with it, and I've a batch to tend. Caleb didn't make her talk about it, but he didn't leave either. He stood beside her in the smokehouse door as the light went out of the sky and the fire glowed in the trench, and the good cool smoke walked slow through 140 pounds of the first real hope that ranch had known in 2 years, and their shoulders were near enough to touch, and neither of them moved away, and that was its own kind of answer. The trouble came on the third night, and it came the way Eleanor had known it would. She woke to Wesley pounding on the kitchen door in the black hour before dawn, his voice high and cracking. Miss Whitaker, Miss Whitaker. The fire's wrong, the smoke's gone white and hot, and I done everything you said, and it won't cool, and I don't... She was up and out the door in her nightdress and shawl before he finished running for the smokehouse, and she smelled it before she reached it. Not the sweet, clean cool of good smoke, but the sharp, scorched, wrong smell of a fire burning hot. And she came around the shed and saw the trench blazing up bright, where it should have smoldered, low flames licking where there ought to have been nothing but glow, and she knew in one look it hadn't done that by itself. Water, she said. Not on the fire, on the trench walls. Cool it slow, don't shock it. Wesley, the wet sacks, the ones we soaked, cover the trench mouth, choke the air, move. And she was already at the trench, and she saw it then in the firelight. The thing that shouldn't be there, pine. Someone had fed pitch pine into her hardwood fire, resiny pine that burned hot and fast and fouled the smoke, and it hadn't walked into the trench on its own. They saved the batch. Barely. Eleanor pulled the pine out with her bare hands and burned her palm doing it and didn't feel it till after, and they choked the fire down to a smolder and cooled the trench and got the smoke walking right again, before the meat took the scorch. And it was a near thing, a very near thing, and when it was done, she stood in the gray dawn light with her burned hand cradled against her and looked at the pine she'd pulled out and knew. Caleb came running. The whole yard was up by now, and took one look at her hand and one look at the pine, and his face went to stone. "Somebody was up here," he said. "Somebody was up here." Eleanor agreed. Her voice was very steady and very cold. "Pitch pine doesn't grow in a hardwood pile, Mr. Rourke. Somebody carried that in and fed it to my fire in the dark, and meant for us to wake to a ruined batch and think we'd failed on our own. Think I'd failed. That's the clever part. It wouldn't have looked like sabotage. It would have looked like the woman didn't know her business after all." She looked up at him. "He's not trying to burn us out. That'd bring the law and the talk. He's trying to make it look like I can't do the thing I said I could. Kill the hope quiet. Let the ranch die looking like it died natural." Around them the men had gone silent and hard. Duff had a length of wood in his fist like a club. Amos had gone the gray of a man remembering old violence. "How'd he get past the dogs?" someone said. "Ain't got but the one dog and it's deaf," said someone else. "How'd he get up the road?" "He didn't come up the road," Wesley said suddenly, and everyone looked at him, and the boy pointed downslope past the corral to the timber. "There's a cut through the trees comes up from the low pasture. Cattle trail. A man on foot could—" "A man who knew the land," Caleb said slowly. "A man who'd bought cattle off this land for 2 years and ridden every foot of it doing it." His hands had closed into fists. "Vane. Or Vane's man," Eleanor said. "It doesn't matter which. What matters is what we do now, and what we do now is nothing." Caleb turned on her. "Nothing. Nothing," Eleanor said, and stepped in front of him, small and burned, and absolutely immovable, and put her good hand flat on his chest to stop him, because his whole body had turned toward the timber, and toward the valley, and toward the man he wanted to kill. "You listen to me, Caleb Rourke. You listen to me right now. You ride down there angry with the dawn barely up and no proof but a stick of pine. And what happens? You lay a hand on Silas Vane, and he's got you for assault. And the note comes due in September, and the sheriff he owns takes this ranch for the debt, and your men have got nothing, and I've got nothing, and Wesley's back to being an orphan with no place, and Vane wins everything he came for, and never has to sabotage another fire again, because you handed him the whole ranch with your own 2 fists. That's what happens. That's exactly what he's counting on." Her voice broke a little and she pushed harder. "He put that pine in my fire, hoping you'd do just this. Don't you dare give it to him. Don't you dare." "It can be pupum." Caleb stood shaking under her hand. "He came onto my land," he said low and terrible. "He came onto my land in the dark, and he burned the one thing that was finally—" His voice cracked clean apart. "You near lost your hand. Look at your hand. My hand'll heal. You near lost your hand for my ranch, and you're telling me to do nothing." "I'm telling you to do the one thing that beats him," Eleanor said fiercely. "I'm telling you to save the batch which we did, and drive it to the camp tomorrow like nothing happened, and sell every pound, and come home with money in your pocket, and a signed order for more. That's not nothing, Caleb. That's the only thing in this world that hurts a man like Silas Vane. Not your fists, your success. You want to make him bleed, live, sell, win. Do the thing he swore a woman couldn't do." She pressed her burned hand harder against him, not feeling the pain of it, now feeling only the frantic pounding of his heart under her palm. "Please. I have watched pride kill everything I ever loved. I watched it kill my father a chair at a time. Don't let it kill this. Not when we're this close." Hoy. The whole yard held its breath. And slowly, Eleanor felt the shaking go out of him. She felt the fists loosen. She felt the wild thing that had turned him toward the timber, turn back, turn toward her. And Caleb, Rourke, looked down at this woman standing between him and his rage, with her ruined hand flat against his chest, and something broke in his face that wasn't rage at all. "You're bleeding on my shirt," he said thickly. "I know. Get inside. Get that hand seen to." He put his own hand over hers over the burn, so gentle it made her breath catch. "We'll drive tomorrow. We'll do it your way. God help me. We'll do it your way." He looked up over her head at his men. "You heard her. Nobody rides to the valley. Nobody says a word about tonight. We fix the fire, we finish the batch, and tomorrow we drive to Deer Lodge and we sell every last pound." His voice hardened again, but it was a different hardness now, aimed the right direction. "And when Silas Vane hears that Rourke beef is feeding the diggings, he can chew on it." That's how we heard him, not before. The men stirred uneasy, wanting blood, and Amos spoke for all of them. "And if he comes again, boss, if he does worse..." Caleb looked down at Eleanor's hand still under his. "Then we'll do worse back," he said. "But by God, we'll do it with the law on our side and money in the bank, and this whole valley knowing who struck first. She's right, and I'm a fool, and we do it her way." He drew a breath. "Now somebody help me get my wife's hand dressed before she bleeds out standing here being braver than the whole lot of us." My wife. It was the first time he'd called her that, and Eleanor heard it, and she saw the moment he heard himself say it, saw the flicker cross his face, but he didn't take it back, and she didn't correct him, and Wesley was already running for the water, and Amos for the clean linen, and the batch was smoking cool and true again in the gray light, and they had not lost. They had bent and they had burned, but they had not lost. That evening, with her hand wrapped and the fire tamed and the men set to watch the timber cut in shifts, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table over her mother's journals and her plan for the drive, and Caleb sat across from her, cleaning a rifle he had no intention of using unless he had to, and neither of them spoke for a long while. Then Caleb said without looking up, "That true what you said about your father, selling chairs?" "Every word." "A chair a day, until there were no chairs. Then the table, then the beds, then the house, then me." Eleanor turned a page. "He was a good man, my father. He just believed that if he worked hard enough and stayed proud enough, the world would come round to being fair. And it never did, and it broke him, and I watched it break him one piece of furniture at a time, and by the end, he couldn't look at me because I was the last thing he had left to sell, and he'd sold everything else first." She smoothed the page flat. "I swore I'd never be as proud as that. Pride's a fine thing to have and a terrible thing to die of." Caleb set the rifle down. "I near rode down that mountain tonight to die of it," he said quietly. "You know that. You saw it. I'd have got myself hanged, or shot, or arrested, and lost everything, and you stood in front of me, burned to the bone, and stopped me." He looked at her across the lamplight. "Why? You don't owe me that. I called you a mouth to feed the first hour I knew you. Why'd you stop me?" Eleanor was quiet a long moment. "Because somewhere in the last 2 weeks," she said, "this stopped being a bargain. Mr. Rourke and I don't know how to make it be one again, and I've near stopped wanting to." She closed the journal. "You asked me back at the start why I'd helped the man who shamed me. I said because I'd nowhere else to go. That was true then. It isn't the whole truth now." She stood and gathered her papers and would not look at him. "I'd best sleep. We drive at first light, and it's 50 miles and Silas Vane between us and the money. Good night, Caleb." She was at the door when he said her name. "Nell." She stopped. Nobody had called her Nell since her mother died. She hadn't told him it. She didn't ask how he knew Amos probably, or the journals her mother's handwriting for my Nell on the flyleaf of the first one. "Yeah," she said, not turning. "Your hand," Caleb said. "Does it hurt bad?" "Some. I'm sorry it was my fire it burned in." Eleanor stood in the doorway with her back to him, and her mother's journals held against her chest, and her burned hand throbbing under its linen. And she thought about all the men who'd wanted her to disappear and be grateful, and about one hard, proud, grieving man on a mountain who'd called her a mouth, and then called her his wife. and now sat in a lamplit kitchen, apologizing for a fire that wasn't even his fault, and she thought her heart might crack right down the middle of it. It burned in a good cause, she said. That's the only kind of hurt worth having. And she went to bed and did not sleep, and neither did he. And in the dark, the wrapped meat cured cool and true, and 50 miles down the mountain, a wagon load of hope waited on the dawn, and somewhere in the valley, a man named Silas Vane sat up late himself, doing his own arithmetic, and finding for the first time in 2 years that the numbers on the Rourke ranch had stopped moving in his favor. They drove at first light with 140 pounds of good cured beef in the wagon bed, and Eleanor's plan folded in her apron pocket, and they did not go the way anyone expected them to go. That was the first thing she'd changed. The road runs past Vane's holding pens, she'd said the night before, over the map spread on the kitchen table. 50 miles and about 18 of them right under his nose. He'll have a man watching that road. He always does. It's how he knew about the salt. So we don't take the road. Her burned hand had traced a fainter line, a thread through the timber. There's an old freight track north over the shoulder of the ridge and down the far draw. Longer, rougher, adds a day. But it comes out at the diggings from the north, and Silas Vane won't have a soul watching the north road, because no man in his right mind hauls beef that way in July. Because it near kills the team, Caleb had said. Because it near kills the team, she'd agreed. Which is why he won't be watching it. We'll go slow. We'll rest the horses at the springs, Amos knows, and we'll come into Deer Lodge from the wrong direction 2 days from now, and the first Silas Vane will hear of it is when the camp quartermaster's already tasted the beef. She'd looked up. He can't sabotage what he can't find. So they went north over the shoulder of the ridge, Caleb driving, and Eleanor beside him, and Wesley on the seat behind, with a rifle across his knees, 16 years old, and gripping it like it might grow legs and run, and Amos following on horseback a quarter mile back to watch the trail behind them for anyone who shouldn't be there. Nobody was for the first day. That was almost worse. I don't like it, Caleb said near noon of the second day as they crested the ridge and started the long rough drop into the draw. Vane's not a man to sit quiet. If he knows we're moving beef, he does something about it. He always does something. Maybe he doesn't know we're moving it. He knows everything. Then maybe, Eleanor said, watching the trail ahead. He doesn't know we went north. Maybe right now there's a man of his sitting under a tree on the valley road, wondering why the Rourke wagon never came, and Silas Vane's about to be very surprised, and I'd like to keep it that way, so let's not borrow trouble that hasn't found us yet. But trouble had already found them. They just didn't know it yet, because Silas Vane had not been watching the valley road. Silas Vane was a patient man and a thorough one, and when word had reached him a week past that the Rourke woman was rebuilding the smokehouse, real word from Hendricks at the Mercantile, who owed Vane more than he'd ever pay. Vane had not sent a man to watch a road. He'd sent a man to Deer Lodge, to the diggings, to the one place a load of Rourke beef would ever have to end up no matter which road it took to get there. Silas Vane owned the man who fed the camp. They found that out at the bottom of the draw when they came on the burned wagon. It sat across the freight track, where the trail narrowed between two rock shoulders, a heavy freight wagon tipped on its side, and charred black, still smoking faint, blocking the only way through. And it hadn't burned by accident, and it hadn't burned long ago. Somebody had rolled it there and fired it that morning, knowing the Rourke wagon was coming, knowing exactly where and when, and Caleb hauled the team to a halt and stood up on the seat and said one word low. Ambush. Down! Amos shouted from behind, spurring up. Get down, boss. They'll be in the rocks. The shot came before he finished it. It cracked off the rock a foot from Caleb's head and whined away into the timber, and everybody was moving at once. Caleb dragging Eleanor down off the seat and behind the wagon. Wesley tumbling after with the rifle, Amos's horse screaming and rearing as a second shot took it through the neck, and the old man went down hard in the trail and rolled cursing behind a rock. Amos! Eleanor was up on her knees before Caleb could stop her. I'm hit, but I ain't dead, Amos hollered back. Leg! Stay down, ma'am, for God's sake. Odds. 2 men, maybe 3. Up in the rocks on the high side of the draw, and the Rourke wagon pinned in the narrow with a burned wreck ahead, and a shooter above, and the horses screaming in the traces. And Caleb had his own rifle up now, firing at the rocks, buying nothing but noise, and Eleanor pressed flat against the wagon wheel with the smell of gun smoke and burning wagon in her throat, and her mind going very fast and very cold, the way it had gone cold the day the men came for the trading house. "Caleb!" She grabbed his sleeve. "Caleb, stop shooting, listen to me. They'll rush us if I stop. They won't rush us. They don't have to, we're pinned and they know it. Listen." She pulled him down. "They didn't burn that wagon to kill us. If they wanted us dead, they'd have shot the team first thing and let us bleed out in the trail. They burned it to stop us, to turn us back. This isn't a killing. Caleb, it's a blockade. Vane doesn't want your body. He wants your beef spoiled in the sun, and you home with your tail between your legs saying, 'The North Road can't be run.' He wants the failure. Same as the fire, always the same. He kills the hope, not the man." Caleb's jaw worked. Another shot spanged off the rocks. "So what do? We don't turn back. That's what he's paying for. So that's the one thing we don't give him." Her mind raced. The team can't get past the wreck with the wagon. But the beef doesn't need the wagon. It needs to reach the camp. How far? 8 miles, maybe 10. Can 2 horses carry 140 pounds of beef 8 miles if we cut them loose and pack it on their backs? Caleb stared at her. "You want to leave the wagon? I want to leave everything that isn't beef and get the beef to that camp today because the beef is the whole war. Caleb, the beef is the only shot we get." Another crack of rifle fire. Wesley returned it wild, terrified. "They've got us pinned in the narrow. But the narrow runs both ways. They can't come down off those rocks without crossing open ground. And you've got a rifle, and so does Wesley. So you and Wesley keep them up in the rocks, keep their heads down, and I take Amos and the 2 horses and the beef, and I go up the draw on foot, leading them staying under the rock overhang where the shooters can't get an angle. I've been watching the ground the whole way down. The overhang runs near half a mile. By the time they figure out the beef's walking away from them, I'll be round the bend and gone, and they'll still have you 2 to worry about." "No." Caleb grabbed her arm hard. "No. You are not walking out into rifle fire. I'm not walking into it. I'm walking under it. There's a difference, and I measured it." "Nell." Caleb Rourke. She took his face in both her hands, the burned one and the good one, and made him look at her right there in the dirt behind the wagon with the bullets flying. "You told me last night you'd do it my way. You said it. This is my way. You cannot beat this man with your fists, and you cannot beat him by dying in this draw, and you cannot beat him by turning that wagon around. The only way you beat Silas Vane today is if that beef reaches that camp, and the only one small enough and quick enough to lead 2 horses under that overhang without giving them a target is me. So you are going to let go of my arm, and you are going to keep those men pinned in the rocks, and you are going to trust that the woman you sent for because she knew how to save your ranch knows how to save it right now today in this draw, because that is exactly what I am about to do." For one terrible second, he held on. Then Caleb Rourke let go of her arm, and it was the hardest thing she'd ever watched a man do, and he said hoarse, "You get hit, I'm coming for you. I don't care about the beef. You get hit, I leave the beef in the trail and I come. You understand me?" "I understand you." She was already moving, crawling for the traces. "Wesley, when I say go, you and Mr. Rourke put 6 shots into those rocks fast as you can work the levers. Don't aim. Just make them keep their heads down. Amos, can you walk?" "I can crawl, ma'am, which is near the same." "Crawl to me." She cut the team loose with her sleeve knife, working by feel, murmuring to the horses the whole time. Calm and low, the way her mother had taught her to gentle a spooked animal, and she got the beef off the wagon and roped in balanced loads across their backs while the shots cracked overhead, and Amos dragged himself to her through the dirt with his leg dark and wet and his teeth set, and she got him up against the near horse's shoulder to lean. "On my go," she called to Caleb. She didn't look at him. She couldn't, or she'd lose her nerve. "Ready? Nell, go." The draw exploded with rifle fire. Caleb and Wesley working their levers fast, as hands could move 6 shots, 8-10 hammering the rocks, and under the cover of it, Eleanor moved out from behind the wagon into the open for 3 awful strides, and then in tight against the rock overhang where the high shooters had no angle down, leading 2 beef-laden horses with one hand and hauling a bleeding old man with the other, walking fast and low and steady along the base of the rock while the world came apart behind her. A shot chipped rock over her head. She didn't stop. Another. She didn't stop. She heard Caleb roar something and heard the rifles answer, and she kept her eyes on the bend ahead. Half a mile of overhang, and she walked it. She walked every foot of it with her heart trying to climb out her throat, and Amos's blood soaking her sleeve, and the horses trembling against her. And she did not stop, and she did not look back, and she did not die. And then the trail turned, and the rock came between her and the guns, and it was quiet. She stood there shaking for exactly 3 breaths. Then she said, "We're not done. Amos, stay on your feet, we've 8 miles yet." And she led them on. Behind her in the narrows, Caleb Rourke waited until he was certain she was clear, until 3 long minutes had passed with no shot from the rocks that could reach her. And then he did the thing she'd told him not to do, because he was who he was, and some things a man cannot leave undone. He went up into the rocks after them. He went up the blind side the way Wesley had spotted, low and fast, and he came on the 2 of them from behind 2 men, not 3 valley toughs. He half recognized one of them, a man he'd seen loading cattle at Vane's pens, and they were watching the trail below for a woman and 2 horses that had already gone, and they never heard him coming, and Caleb Rourke came up out of the rocks behind 2 men who'd shot his oldest friend and burned his road and tried to starve his ranch to death, and he did not kill them, though God knew he wanted to. He took their rifles, he took their boots, and he left them afoot in the timber 18 miles from anywhere with a message. "Tell Silas Vane," he said, standing over them with a rifle in each hand and murder in his eyes and holding on to the last thread of Eleanor's voice in his head. "Live sell win. That's how you heard him. Tell him the beef's already gone. Tell him it's walking to the diggings right now and there's not a thing he can do about it. And tell him the next man he sends up my mountain I won't leave with his boots. I'll leave with more." He threw their rifles down the far side of the draw where they'd take an hour to find. "Now walk." Then he went and found Wesley, and they took the 2 saddle horses and rode hard round the long way, and they caught up to Eleanor 4 miles on, and Caleb near fell off his horse getting to her, and she near fell over, reaching him. And neither of them said the thing they both nearly said, because Amos was bleeding, and the beef was walking, and there were still 6 miles to go. They came into Deer Lodge diggings from the north at the tail end of the 2nd day, filthy and bloodied and half dead on their feet. 2 beef-laden horses and 2 saddle horses and a wounded old man and a woman with a burned hand and a cowboy who'd stopped looking at the beef and started looking at the woman. And the first thing they learned, the very first thing, was that Silas Vane had gotten there first after all. The camp quartermaster was a heavy-set man named Bowles, and he came out of the commissary tent wiping his mouth, and he took one look at the Rourke party and his face closed like a door. "You'd be the Rourke outfit," he said. "We would," Caleb said. "Got preserved beef, good beef, cured proper, come to sell to the camp." Camp's supplied. Camp's paying triple for meat that comes up spoiled from the south, Eleanor said, stepping forward, and Bowles's eyes flicked to her and dismissed her, and she saw it, and she kept talking anyway. "You're feeding 2,000 men off provisions that lose a third to rot before they arrive because they come the long hot way from the valley suppliers. I'm offering you clean cured beef weighed and recorded at a fair price that'll keep in this heat because it was cured to keep in this heat. You'd be a poor quartermaster to turn that down without tasting it." "I got a supply contract, ma'am." Bowles said ma'am the way another man might say something filthy. "Exclusive. Signed a month back with the Bitterroot Cattle and Land Company. All camp provisions come through Bitterroot. Company won't let me buy off no independent outfit, and specially—" His eyes went to Caleb, not off Rourke. "Was told particular. No Rourke beef. Man was real clear on it." The bottom dropped out of the day. Eleanor felt it drop. She saw Caleb's face go gray under the dirt. Bitterroot Cattle and Land. The name off the note in the ledger, the $380 due in September secured against the ranch. She'd thought it was a bank. It wasn't a bank. Bitterroot, she said slowly. Who owns Bitterroot, Mr. Bowles? Bowles shrugged. Company's a company. Who owns it? Fella named Vane holds the paper, I hear. Silas Vane. But it's a company, legal and all. Bowles was already turning away. Sorry for your trouble. Long way to come for nothing. There's water at the far end for the horses, you're welcome to that much. And that was the twist that near broke them standing there at the end of 2 days and 50 miles and an ambush and a burned wagon, and a bleeding friend, Silas Vane, didn't just buy Caleb's cattle cheap and own his road and his note. Silas Vane owned the only market too. He'd bought the camp out from under them a month ago, the moment he'd heard a woman was rebuilding the Smokehouse. He'd seen the whole play before they'd made a single move of it. The failed batches, the sabotaged fire, the burned wagon. Those were just for sport, just to hurry it along. The real trap had been set weeks ago, and it had no rifles in it at all. It was a piece of paper in a commissary tent that said no man on earth could buy Rourke beef in the one place Rourke beef could be sold. They'd walked their hope 50 miles into a wall. Wesley made a sound like a boy who'd just watched Christmas canceled. Amos, propped against a horse with his leg roughly bound, closed his eyes. And Caleb turned to Eleanor, and there was no rage in his face now. No fists, just the flat gray hopelessness of a man who'd let himself hope one time too many, and been shown one time too many, exactly why he'd sworn he never would again. He had us before we left the yard, Caleb said quietly. He had us a month ago. He looked at the beef roped to the trembling horses. We near died in that draw, hauling 140 pounds of beef to a market he closed before we ever cured it. A terrible calm came over him. Nell, I'm sorry. I let you burn your hand, and I let you walk under rifle fire, and I let Amos take a bullet, and all for a wall he'd already built. I should have known. He always thinks 4 moves ahead. I should have... Stop! Eleanor's voice cut across him low and hard. Stop it right now. Don't you dare do that. Don't you dare go gray on me at the last fence. There's no way past a signed exclusive contract, Nell. That's the law. He owns the law, and now he owns the market too. There's a man, Eleanor said. Caleb blinked. What? A contract's just a piece of paper, Caleb. A market's not a piece of paper. A market's 2,000 hungry men and 1 quartermaster who has to feed them, and that quartermaster just told us 3 things without meaning to. She'd stopped shaking. Her mind was going cold and fast and clear again. He told us the valley provisions come up spoiled a third, lost to rot. He told us the camp's paying triple for meat that half rots on the road. And he told us his contract's with a company that's really just Silas Vane holding paper. She turned and looked back at the commissary tent. Mr. Bowles doesn't answer to Silas Vane, Caleb. Mr. Bowles answers to 2,000 miners who'll skin him alive if the beef runs short or comes up green. And right now, Mr. Bowles is buying rotten meat at triple price from a company that doesn't care whether he lives or dies, because the man who owns it lives 50 miles away and has never once had to look a starving miner in the eye. That's not a wall. That's a crack. And I've spent my whole life finding the crack in men who thought they'd sealed themselves shut. She started walking toward the commissary tent. Nell, Caleb caught her arm. What are you going to do? I'm going to feed him, Eleanor said. Get me a knife and a fire. He said the camp's supplied. He didn't say the camp was fed. What she did next, Caleb Rourke would tell for the rest of his life. She did not argue the contract. She did not beg. She did not mention Silas Vane's name again. She walked to the cook fire outside the commissary tent, where the camp cook was stewing a great kettle of the valley beef. Gray meat half turned the smell of it wrong, even from 10 feet. The smell she knew better than any smell on earth, and she asked polite as a Sunday visit if she might use a corner of his fire, and while he gaped at her, she cut a pound off her own cured beef and laid it in a clean pan and set it to warm, and the smell that came up off it clean, deep, smoke-rich. The smell of meat cured right cut through the wrong reek of the kettle like a church bell through a bar room, and men began one by one to turn their heads. Miners, off shift waiting on supper, a dozen of them, then 20 drawn by a smell they hadn't smelled in months. "That for supper," one called. "That's Rourke beef," Eleanor called back clear and carrying. "Cured on the mountain. First of it. There's 140 pounds on those horses, and I mean to sell it to your camp, but your quartermaster's under contract to a company that ships you meat that rots on the road. So I can't sell it to you. Company won't allow it." She lifted the pan. "But there's no law says I can't let you smell what you're not allowed to eat." It was, Amos would say later, the most dangerous thing he ever watched a woman do, and the smartest, because the miners crowded in, and they smelled the good beef, and looked at the gray kettle, and one of them, a big Cornishman with a voice like a rock slide, said, "Bowles, Bowles, get out here." And when Bowles came out wiping his hands, the Cornishman pointed at the kettle, and then at Eleanor's pan and said, "You been feeding us that, while there's this to be had. What's this about a contract won't let you buy clean meat?" And Bowles looked at 40 hungry, angry armed miners, and he looked at the commissary tent full of rotting valley beef he'd have to answer for. And he looked at Eleanor Whitaker standing there with a pan of the best-smelling beef in the territory, and a ledger already open in her burned hand. And Caleb watched the quartermaster do the exact arithmetic Eleanor had done in her head 6 minutes before, that a contract with a faraway company was a piece of paper, but 2,000 hungry men with rifles were a fact. "The contract says exclusive supply of camp provisions," Eleanor said quietly, just to Bowles, while the miners grumbled. "It doesn't say a word about what the men buy with their own wages on their own time, does it? You supply the camp mess. Fine, keep your contract. But there's nothing stops these men buying private meat off an independent seller for their own suppers. And there's nothing stops you telling Silas Vane hand to God that you never bought a pound of Rourke beef for the camp. Because you won't. They will." She let it sit. "You keep your contract clean, Mr. Bowles. I'll sell straight to the men. And when Silas Vane comes asking, you tell him the God's truth, that you honored every word of his paper, and it didn't matter, because you can own a contract, but you can't own a hungry man's wages." Bowles looked at her a long, long moment. Then slow something that was almost a smile cracked his heavy face. "Ma'am," he said, "I've been choking on that man's rotten beef and his one-sided paper for a month, and I couldn't buy my way out of it if I wanted to. But you're right. What the men do with their own wages ain't camp provisions, and it ain't my business, and it sure ain't Bitterroots." He raised his voice to the crowd. "Boys, this lady's selling clean cured mountain beef, private sale, cash on the barrel, and it ain't camp mess, so it ain't my contract. You want good meat for once. You deal with her direct." The roar that went up scattered birds off the ridge. They sold 140 pounds of beef in under an hour cut and weighed and recorded in Eleanor's ledger to the ounce cash pressed into Wesley's hat until the hat wouldn't hold it, miners buying 2 and 3 pounds at a time and asking when there'd be more. And one grizzled old digger, holding a cured strip to his nose with his eyes shut like a man at prayer, saying, "Lord, I ain't tasted meat didn't fight back in half a year," and Bowles himself buying 5 pounds for personal, which everyone understood meant the man was hedging his bet clean over to the winning side. And when it was done, when the money was counted, and it came to more than 3 times what Silas Vane had ever paid more cash in 1 hour than the Rourke Ranch had seen in a season, the Cornishman who'd started it clapped Caleb on the shoulder and said, "Your missus is a caution, Rourke. When's the next load? Half these boys'll starve waiting on it." 2 weeks, Eleanor said before Caleb could answer. 2 weeks, and every 2 weeks after regular as the moon. You tell the camp, Rourke beef North Road 1st of the month and the 15th. And you tell them one thing more. She closed her ledger. You tell them the Bitterroot Company tried to keep it from you. Burned a wagon in the draw to stop this very load. Shot this man's horse and put a bullet in his oldest friend's leg to keep clean beef off your table so they could keep selling you rot at triple the price. She looked around the crowd of hard men gone suddenly still. I'm not asking you to fight anybody's fight. But when a man sends riders to burn beef meant for your supper table so he can go on feeding you garbage at a profit well, you're grown men. You'll know what to do with that. The silence after that was a different kind of silence. And Caleb Rourke, standing filthy and bloodied and stunned in the middle of a mining camp that an hour before had turned them away, understood at last all the way down the thing Eleanor had been trying to tell him since the day she threw rotten beef at his boots, that Silas Vane's whole power was built on nobody ever seeing the truth of him. On distance, on paper, on no hungry man ever connecting the rot on his plate to the rich man 50 miles off who profited from it. And Eleanor had just stood in the middle of that camp and connected it out loud in front of 40 witnesses who'd carry it to 2,000 more. She hadn't just sold the beef. She'd taken the one thing Silas Vane couldn't afford to lose. She'd taken his story. She'd told 2,000 men who he really was, and there was no burned wagon, no bought contract, no sabotaged fire that could untell it now. They rode out of Deer Lodge that night with Wesley's hat full of money, and Amos's leg properly doctored by the camp's own surgeon, who'd waived off payment, saying the miners had passed a cap for it, on account of the beef, and they made camp at the springs. Amos knew, and for the first time in the whole ordeal, there was laughter around a fire, Wesley counting the money over and over, like he couldn't believe it, stayed the same each time. Amos telling the surgeons fussing like it was the funniest thing that ever happened to a leg. Caleb waited until the others slept. Then he came and sat by Eleanor, at the edge of the firelight, where she sat awake with her burned hand cradled in her lap, looking at nothing. "You didn't just sell beef today," he said. "No, you told 2,000 men what he is." He shook his head slow. "He's gonna know by tomorrow, every word. He's gonna know you stood in that camp and turned his own market against him, and he is not gonna sit quiet for it, Nell. What you did today that wasn't dodging him anymore. That was war. I know." Eleanor watched the fire. "I've known since the draw. He tried to have us killed today. Caleb not just stopped killed, that ambush could have gone either way, and he knew it and sent the men anyway. A man who'll do that isn't going to be shamed into leaving us be. So I stopped trying to dodge him." She turned and looked at Caleb across the small fire, and her face in the light was tired and fierce and afraid all at once, and more beautiful to him than anything he'd let himself look at in 4 years. "I decided somewhere back in that draw when I was walking under those guns thinking I might die for 140 pounds of beef, I decided I was done being careful. He wants the ranch. He's owned your note and your road and your market, and now he's tried to own your life, and I am done. Caleb, I am done letting a man like that decide whether the people She stopped, made herself go on. "Whether the people I've come to care about live or die. So yes, it's war. I started it on purpose, and I'd do it again." Caleb looked at her a long time. "The people you've come to care about," he said quietly. Eleanor looked back at the fire and didn't answer. "Nell, don't," she said. "Not tonight, not with Amos shot and the money still in a boy's hat and that man down the mountain sharpening whatever he's going to do to us next. I don't have room for it tonight, Caleb. I've only got room for keeping us alive." Her voice was not quite steady. "Ask me again when we're not bleeding. Ask me again when this is done, and Silas Vane can't hurt anybody I care about anymore. If we live to see it, you ask me again, and I'll tell you the whole truth of it. But not tonight." Caleb was quiet. Then he reached over slow and took her burned hand in both of his, so careful the way he had in the yard, and he didn't say anything at all. He just held it. Held the hand that had pulled burning pine out of a fire for his ranch and cut beef loose under rifle fire for his men, and stayed steady on his chest while she talked him back from the edge of throwing his whole life away, and Eleanor let him hold it. And they sat like that by the low fire, while the others slept, and the horses shifted. And 50 miles down the mountain, a man who thought 4 moves ahead sat with a report of everything that had happened at Deer Lodge that day, and found for the first time in his careful, ruthless life that he had made a mistake, that the small, tired woman he'd dismissed as a cook had walked into the one place he couldn't reach, and turned his own hungry market into a courtroom, and told the truth about him to 2,000 men who ate what he sold them. Silas Vane did not sleep either, and when the sun came up, he sent for his lawyer and he called in the note. Not in September. Now. $380 due in full in 14 days. Or the Rourke Ranch, every acre, every head, the Smokehouse, and all forfeit to the Bitterroot Cattle and Land Company. By the letter of the law, Silas Vane owned as surely as he owned everything else in the valley. He'd lost the story. He knew it. So he reached for the one thing a story couldn't beat. He reached for the paper. The paper came up the mountain in the hand of a valley lawyer named Pruitt, who rode into the yard 4 days after they got home from Deer Lodge, dressed too fine for the country and sweating through his collar, and he did not get down off his horse. Caleb Rourke. He held the folded document out at arm's length like a man offering meat to a dog he didn't trust. Notice of demand from the Bitterroot Cattle and Land Company. The full sum of your note, $380, is called due and payable within 14 days of this date. Failing payment, the company forecloses on the property stock and improvements per the terms you signed. He dropped it when Caleb didn't reach for it, let it flutter to the dust. That's the whole of my business. I'll not take coffee. September, Caleb said, very quiet. That note's due September. It's July. Read your terms, Mr. Rourke. Company reserves the right to call the note at will upon evidence the securities being devalued. Pruitt's mouth twitched. Man tears out a smokehouse, runs beef off the recorded road, undertakes ventures that might impair the property's value companies within its rights to protect its interest. 14 days. He gathered his reins. I'd start counting cattle to sell was I you. Though I hear the market's poor. Awful poor. For Rourke beef especially. He rode out. Nobody stopped him. Eleanor picked the paper up out of the dust and read it twice, standing very still while the men gathered around her the way they did now, the way they'd started to somewhere on the road back from Deer Lodge, not looking to Caleb, first looking to her. 14 days, Wesley said. We got that money from the camp. We got Amos how much we got. 200 and change, Amos said heavily. After the salt debt and the doctrine and the supplies, $211. So we're short. $169 short, Eleanor said, folding the paper. In 14 days. She looked up. And even if we sold every head of cattle on this mountain tomorrow at Vane's prices, which are the only prices on offer because he owns the buying, same as he owns the note, we'd get pennies on the dollar and hand him the ranch empty for the trouble. That's the trap. It was always the trap. He doesn't want the money. He never wanted the money. He wants the land and the water and the timber, and he's built it so that the only way to pay him is to sell him the very things that make the ranch worth having. She said it flat, working it through out loud. He calls the note. We can't pay in cash. So we sell cattle to raise cash, but he's the only buyer, so he sets the price low, so we have to sell nearly all of them to raise enough, so even if we scrape the money together, we've got a ranch with no herd. He wins either way. Pay and be ruined, or don't pay and be foreclosed. That's the whole play. That was always the whole play. The men were silent. So we're finished, Duff said. Not angry, just tired. All that. The smokehouse, the road, the camp your hand, Amos's leg, all that, and he beats us with a piece of paper anyhow. No, Eleanor said. Ma'am, with respect, $169 and 14 days off a herd we can't sell for affairs. I said no. She turned and looked at all of them, and something in her voice stopped Duff cold. I've spent my whole life watching men with paper crush men without it. I watched it take my father's house. I know exactly what that paper is, Mr. Duff, and I know exactly what it isn't. She held it up. It says the note can be called if the security's being devalued. That's the hook he hung it on, that we tore out the smokehouse and ran the north road and impaired the property's value. She looked at Caleb. Caleb. Has the property's value gone down since I came? Caleb blinked. Gone down? It's the smokehouse works now. We're selling beef at triple. The place is worth 3 times what it was a month ago. Yes, Eleanor said softly. It is. So a court would have to find that a working smokehouse in a proven market and a herd worth 3 times last month's price is somehow a devaluation. That's the lie in the paper, Caleb. He wrote a clause meant to be used against a failing ranch, and he's trying to use it against a ranch that just stopped failing. It won't hold. Not in front of an honest judge." She lowered the paper. "The problem is there isn't an honest judge in this valley. He owns them same as he owns everything, so we don't fight it in this valley." "Then where?" Caleb said. Eleanor was quiet a moment. "There's a circuit judge," she said slowly. "There has to be. Territory this size, there's a federal circuit judge that rides it, comes through, hears the cases. The local courts can't or won't the land disputes and the fraud claims. My father dealt with one back before when a supplier tried to cheat him. A circuit judge isn't bought by any one valley because he doesn't belong to any one valley. Where's the circuit court sit, Caleb? When's it next in session near here?" Nobody knew. But Bowles, the quartermaster, would know the camp lived and died on federal contracts and mining claims, and every one of those touched the circuit court. So Wesley was on a horse within the hour, riding for Deer Lodge with a note in his pocket, and he was back in 2 days with the answer, and the answer was a knife's edge. The circuit judge, a federal man named Harmon, said to be flint-hard and unbuyable, which was the same thing said of him, whether by men who feared him or men who hoped in him, was holding session at the territorial seat in Helena. 3 days hard ride. And he was there for 11 more days, and then he moved on and wouldn't circle back for 3 months long past the 14-day deadline, long past the foreclosure. 11 days. 3 days ride each way. Which left them 5 days at the outside to build a case that would make a federal judge stop a legal foreclosure and to get that case in front of him before Silas Vane, who would surely hear of it, could get his own men to Helena to bury it. "It's not enough time," Amos said. "It's exactly enough time," Eleanor said, "if we don't waste an hour of it. And it's the only time we've got, so it'll have to be enough." She was already moving into the house to the table to the journals and the ledger. Because here's the thing Silas Vane doesn't understand about paper, and it's the same thing he didn't understand about the camp. He thinks paper is his weapon. He thinks because he's got more paper and better lawyers' papers on his side. She spread the ledger open. But paper cuts both ways. He built his whole scheme on paper, the note, the exclusive contract, the low prices, quarter after quarter, all of it written down, all of it recorded, because a man that careful writes everything down. And a man who writes everything down leaves a trail. I've been reading that trail for 3 weeks in this ledger, and I didn't even know what I was looking at. She looked up, and her eyes had gone bright and hard. "I know what I'm looking at now." What she'd found, she laid out for Caleb that night page by page, in a voice that shook a little at the size of it. "Look at the beef prices. Quarter by quarter, 2 years marching straight down. You always thought that was just the market prices falling hard times, nothing to be done." She traced the column. "But look what he paid you in the spring of the first year. And look what the camp pays now that we know the camp pays triple. Silas Vane bought your beef at a falling price and sold it to the camp at a rising one. And the gap between what he paid you and what he charged them grew every single quarter. That's not a market, Caleb. A market moves both ends. This only moved one. He drove your price down on purpose year over year, while the camp price climbed, and he pocketed the whole spread, and he did it to every independent rancher on this mountain, not just you." She pulled out a second sheet, her own hand columns she'd built over 3 sleepless nights. "I did the arithmetic. If the prices had held fair, just steady, you'd have cleared your note 2 years ago and never owed him a dime. The debt isn't real, Caleb. He manufactured it. He underpaid you into debt on purpose so he could call the note and take the land. The note is the crime, not the missed payment. The note itself." Caleb stared at the pages. "That's..." He shook his head. "That's just my ledger. My word against his. He'll say I kept the books wrong or I'm lying or... Which is why we don't go with just your ledger." Eleanor's voice dropped. "We go with everyone's." And that was the twist that turned the whole thing over. Eleanor had understood sometime in the last sleepless nights that Silas Vane's greatest strength was also the shape of his ruin. He hadn't cheated one rancher. He'd cheated all of them, every independent outfit on the mountain, the same falling prices, the same manufactured debt, the same notes held by the same company, the same trap closing on all of them, one at a time. So none of them ever compared notes, because a man being slowly strangled in private never thinks to ask if his neighbor is being strangled too. "How many other ranches owe Bitterroot?" she asked Amos. The old man thought. "The Kellers, the Dutchman Voss. Old man Petrie, before he died, his widow's got the note now. That fella down at Cedar Coulee." He counted on his fingers. 5, 6 outfits I know of. All of 'em sellin' cheap to Vane. All of 'em scrapin'. Couple of 'em lost ground to him already. Petrie's whole south section went to Bitterroot 2 years back when the old man couldn't pay. 6 ranches, Eleanor said. 6 ranches all sold beef to the same buyer at prices that only ever fell, all carrying notes from the same company, at least one already foreclosed. 6 sets of books, Caleb. 6 ledgers that all show the same pattern. She stood up. One rancher with a grudge is a man a judge might not believe. 6 ranchers, 6 ledgers, all showing the identical scheme, one already robbed of his land. That's not a grudge. That's a pattern. That's fraud. And a federal circuit judge who can't be bought lives for exactly that, because a man like Vane in a territory like this is precisely the kind of rot the circuit court was made to cut out. She was pulling on her coat. "We've got 5 days. I need to see 6 ledgers and get them all to Helena. So I'm going to go ask 6 proud, scared, ruined ranchers to trust a woman they've never met with. The one thing they've got left, the proof they've been robbed. Tonight. Starting with the Kellers." "You're not going alone," Caleb said, standing. "I'm going alone to the Kellers because a woman alone hurt asking for help gets a door opened where O'Rourke and his men get a rifle. You'll frighten them. They're frightened enough. Let me be the small hurt woman who understands Caleb. It's the truest thing I've got, and it opens doors." She paused at the door. "But I'll need you for the last part. I'll need you and every man who can ride. Because getting 6 ledgers is one thing, and getting them 3 days to Helena ahead of Vane's men is another, and Vane will know what we're doing the moment the second rancher talks. He always knows. So we move fast, and we move together, and we do not stop for anything." "Agreed." Caleb crossed the room and stood in front of her. "You walked under rifle fire for my ranch," he said. "You think I'm going to let you ride the valley alone at night talking 6 scared men out of their last hope? I think you're going to trust me to know how to do the one thing I'm better at than any man alive," Eleanor said gently, "which is walk into a room where everyone's given up and give them a reason not to. I've done it for your men. I did it for Pettibone and Duff and Wesley and you. Let me do it for 6 more. Then we ride to Helena together." She reached up without quite meaning to, and touched his jaw, the ruff of 2 days' beard, the first time she'd touched him when there wasn't blood or danger to excuse it. "Trust me one more time, Caleb Rourke. I've earned it, haven't I?" Caleb caught her hand against his face and held it there. "You've earned everything," he said low. "You've earned more than I've got to give. That's what scares me." "Then give me the ledgers and a fast horse," Eleanor said, "and we'll talk about the rest in Helena." She rode the valley for 3 nights. She went to the Kellers first, and Martha Keller opened the door a crack with a shotgun behind it, and Eleanor stood on the step, small and burned, and told the truth. All of it. The falling prices, the manufactured debt, the called note, the 6 ranches. And she watched Martha Keller's face change from suspicion to fear, to something harder and older than both. And Martha Keller said, "My husband coughs blood every night worrying over that note. You're telling me it ain't even real." And Eleanor said, "I'm telling you it's a crime, and you're one of 6 who can prove it. And if you'll give me your ledger, I'll take it to a federal judge who can't be bought." And Martha Keller went and got the ledger without waking her husband, and pressed it into Eleanor's hands and said, "You bring that man down. You bring Silas Vane down for what he's done to the men on this mountain. My Tom's dying by inches over a debt you say he don't even owe." D. Voss the Dutchman took more convincing, and the Cedar Coulee man refused outright until Eleanor laid Keller's ledger beside his own on the table and showed him the identical curve of the falling prices. The same hand of the same thief in both their books, and the man went white and quiet, and got up and fetched his ledger from a locked box and set it down and said only, "I thought it was just me. I thought I was a poor manager. 2 years I thought that." And Eleanor said, "He wanted you to think that. He wanted every one of you alone and ashamed. That's how the theft stays hidden. 6 men, each too proud to admit he's failing, never once asking the neighbor if he's failing too." And the cedar coolie man put his face in his hands. The Petrie widow was the one who broke Eleanor's own composure, because the Petries had already lost the south section, gone to Bitterroot 2 years back, the old man dead of the shame of it the following winter, and the widow, a small fierce woman near 70, listened to the whole of it, and then said, "So it wasn't Amos Petrie's failing that killed him. It was that man's stealing." And she was quiet a moment, and then she said, "I've got the old ledgers. I've got every one. I kept them because I couldn't bear to look at them and couldn't bear to burn them. You take them. You take them to your judge, and you tell him a woman who buried a good man over a lie he was made to believe about himself wants to watch Silas Vane answer for it." She fetched the books. Then she took Eleanor's burned hand in both her own and said, "I don't know you, girl, but you rode out at night with a hurt hand to give 6 broken families back the truth of themselves. Whatever you are to that Rourke man, you're worth 10 of any of these men who let it happen to them one at a time and called it their own fault. Now go." Eleanor rode back to the Rourke ranch on the 3rd night with 6 ledgers roped in oilcloth against the weather, the same oilcloth her mother had bound her journals in, and her whole body shaking with exhaustion, and something else. Something that felt like the thing her mother had meant when she'd said, "The only knowing worth having is the kind that doesn't die with you," because she was carrying 6 families' proof out of the dark, and it had been there the whole time in the open, in 6 locked boxes, and all it had needed was somebody to walk into 6 rooms and say the truth out loud, until 6 ashamed men and women believed it, and women believed. They rode for Helena at dawn. Caleb, Eleanor, Wesley, and Duff on the 4 fastest horses the ranch had with the ledgers and Eleanor's own arithmetic, and a hard 3 days ahead of them, and they had gone not 4 miles down the mountain when they saw the dust of riders coming up. Silas Vane's men, 6 of them spread across the trail. "He knows," Caleb said, hauling up. "Somebody talked. He knows we've got the ledgers, and he knows where we're taking them." His hand went to his rifle. "Nell, get behind me." "No." Eleanor's mind was already moving. "No, listen, count them. 6 men on the trail down. That's near every man Vane's got. He's put everything on stopping us on this road because he thinks this road is the only way to Helena." She turned in the saddle and looked back up the mountain. "But it isn't. Wesley, the north freight track. The one we took to Deer Lodge. Does it connect on past the diggings? Can a rider get from Deer Lodge to Helena?" "Longer," Wesley said. "But yeah, freight goes that way, 2-3 days. Then we split." Eleanor was already pulling the ledgers half out of her saddlebag. "Caleb, you and Duff take the main road and you make them chase you. Draw them off. Lead them anywhere. Keep 6 of Vane's men busy running you down a road that goes nowhere near where the ledgers are going. And Wesley and I take the north track through Deer Lodge to Helena with the books." She was dividing them as she spoke 3 ledgers to her own bag, 3 thrust at Wesley. "They're watching for you, Caleb. You're the one they know. They'll chase the Rourke man and the fighting man and never look twice at a woman and a boy on the freight road. We'll be past Deer Lodge before they know they chased the wrong riders." "You are not taking my 16-year-old and riding 3 days through open country with the proof that hangs Silas Vane while I lead his guns the other way. That is exactly what I'm doing," Eleanor said. "Because it's the only thing that works, and you know it's the only thing that works, and we don't have time to argue it on a trail with his men 4 minutes out." She wheeled her horse. "You told me in the draw you'd do it my way. You did, and we won. Do it my way again. Draw them off. Give us the road. And Caleb," her voice caught, "don't you get killed doing it. Don't you dare. You lead them and you lose them, and you come to Helena. You hear me? You come find me at that courthouse. Because there's a thing I said I'd tell you when we weren't bleeding, And I mean to tell it to you on the courthouse steps with Silas Vane finished, and I can't do that if you're dead in a ditch being brave. So lose them and live. Promise me." Caleb looked at her across the space between their horses, with 6 riders coming up the mountain, and everything they'd built balanced on the next 10 seconds. "I promise," he said. "You get those books to Harmon. I'll draw the wolves. And Nell." He didn't finish it. There wasn't time, and it was too big for the time there was. He just looked at her, and she looked back, and it was all there in the look, everything neither of them had said. "Ride," he said. "Ride, and don't look back, and I'll see you in Helena." She rode. She and Wesley cut up the mountain for the north track, and Caleb and Duff spurred straight down the main road into the teeth of Vane's men, whooping, drawing every eye, leading 6 riders on a 2-day chase down roads that led nowhere near Helena. And it worked. It worked exactly as she'd said, because Silas Vane's men saw the Rourke man riding hell for leather, and never once thought to wonder why he was riding away from the territorial seat instead of toward it. Eleanor and Wesley rode 3 days. They rode through Deer Lodge, where Bowles the quartermaster, hearing where they were bound, and why gave them fresh horses and a sworn statement of his own, the exclusive contract, the Rotting Valley beef, the order he'd been given in writing to buy. No Rourke beef, all of it signed and witnessed. "For your judge," he said, "and tell him a camp of 2,000 men will swear to every word if he wants us to." They rode on north with 7 documents now, instead of 6, and Eleanor never slept more than 3 hours, and Wesley grew up somewhere on that road, went from a boy gripping a rifle to a young man who watched the trail and rationed the water and said, on the last night, "My daddy died owing money he couldn't pay, ma'am. Different valley, different man, same kind of thing, I reckon. I never knew you could fight it. I thought you just took it. I thought that was how the world was." And Eleanor said, "That's how they need you to think it is, Wesley. That's the whole of their power, men believing there's nothing to be done. There's always something to be done. It's just hard, and it's frightening, and most folks are too tired to do it. But there's always something." And the boy was quiet a long time, and then he said, "I'm gonna remember that my whole life." And Eleanor believed him. They reached Helena on the morning of the 9th day, since the notice with 5 days of the deadline gone, and the ledgers safe, and Judge Harmon's court in session for 2 more days only. And Silas Vane was already there. He was standing on the courthouse steps when Eleanor and Wesley rode up, filthy and swaying in the saddle, standing there in a fine coat with his lawyer Pruitt beside him, and he was smiling, because of course he'd come himself. Of course, a man who thought 4 moves ahead hadn't put everything on 6 riders on a mountain road. He'd sent the 6 to catch what they could and come to Helena himself to be sure, because Silas Vane never trusted a thing to hired men that he could ruin in person. "Miss Whitaker." He tipped his hat mockingly gentle. "You look a fright. Long ride." He glanced at the saddlebags at the oilcloth. "I do hope you haven't come all this way to waste the court's time. I've already spoken with the clerk, filed my foreclosure, all in order, quite legal. And I've mentioned to his honor's clerk that there may be a disturbed woman coming, wife of a debtor, likely to make wild accusations out of desperation." "Hysterical," I said. "Not to be credited." The smile widened. "You've had a hard month, ma'am. Everyone knows it. A woman married off to a failing ranch, grasping at anything. So sad. The judge has been warned to expect you." And there it was. The last trap sprung on the courthouse steps. He'd gotten there first, not to fight the ledgers, but to poison the well before she ever reached it, to make sure that when a dust-caked, exhausted, wild-eyed woman came stumbling in with a bag of accusations, the judge already had a word for her in his head, and the word was hysterical. Wesley's hand went white on his reins. "That ain't, ma'am. That ain't true. You're the smartest." "It's all right, Wesley." Eleanor swung down off the horse, and she did not stumble, and she straightened her spine, and she looked Silas Vane full in the face for the first time. This man she'd been fighting for a month, and never once met this quiet, smiling rich man who'd starved 22 of her people and burned her fire and shot Amos's horse and driven a good old rancher into the ground over a lie. "Mr. Vane," she said, "you're right about one thing. It has been a hard month." She reached into her saddlebag and drew out the oilcloth bundle unhurried and tucked it under her arm. "But you've made a mistake. I've watched men like you make my whole life. You think because I'm small and tired and a woman that what's in this bag is desperation." She stepped up onto the first stair close enough now to see the smile falter at the edges. "It isn't desperation, Mr. Vane. It's arithmetic. 6 ledgers. 7 with the quartermasters. 2 years of your falling prices and your rising sales and every dollar of the spread you stole in 6 different hands in 6 different books you never thought would sit on one table. You told the judge to expect a hysterical woman." She climbed another step past him now toward the courthouse doors, and she said it over her shoulder without slowing. "You should have told him to expect a bookkeeper. Good morning, Mr. Vane. I'll see you inside." And Eleanor Whitaker walked through the courthouse doors with 6 families' proof under her arm and a mining camp's sworn word in her bag to lay the whole of Silas Vane's careful paper empire on a federal judge's table. While somewhere on the roads behind her, a mountain cowboy who'd once called her a mouth to feed was riding hard for Helena through the dust, having lost the wolves, keeping his promise coming to find her on the courthouse steps. The clerk tried to turn her away at the rail. "Court's for parties to filed matters, ma'am. You'll want to wait outside. His Honor's been told there may be a—" The man had the grace to look uncomfortable. "An emotional woman, likely to interrupt. I'm to keep the aisle clear." "I am a party to a filed matter," Eleanor said. "The Bitterroot Cattle and Land Company filed a foreclosure this morning against the Rourke Ranch. I'm the wife of the debtor, and I've come to contest it, which is my right under the law, and I have here documentary evidence bearing on the company's standing to foreclose it all." She set the oilcloth bundle on the rail unhurried. "You can enter me on the docket as a contesting party, Mr. Clerk, or you can explain to a federal judge why you turned away evidence in a fraud matter, because a rich man told you the woman carrying it was hysterical. One of those goes badly for you. I'd think on which." The clerk thought on which. Then he wrote her name in the book. Judge Harmon heard the Bitterroot foreclosure at 2 o'clock that afternoon, and Silas Vane's lawyer, Pruitt, rose first, smooth and quick, and it was over in 90 seconds, by his telling a defaulted note, a delinquent debtor, a clause invoked, all in order for closure to proceed, and Pruitt was already gathering his papers, when Harmon, a lean gray man with eyes like a hawk on a fence post, said, "Sit down, counselor. I'm told there's a contesting party. Your Honor, I did warn your clerk, the debtor's wife. Distraught, I'm afraid, and forgive me not entirely to be relied upon in matters of—" "I'll decide who's to be relied upon in my court," Harmon said without heat. "Come forward, Mrs. Rourke." She was not, in fact, Mrs. Rourke. Yet the marriage the letter had promised had never been solemnized, swallowed by a month of fire and blood and ledgers. But Eleanor did not correct him, because a name was a small thing, and the ranch was everything, and she came forward. "You've evidence, I'm told," Harmon said, "bearing on the company's standing to foreclose." "I have, Your Honor. May I lay it out?" "That's what you're here for. Lay it out." And Eleanor Whitaker laid it out. She did not weep, and she did not plead, and she did not once raise her voice. She laid the 6 ledgers on the table in a row, and beside them, Bowles's sworn statement, and beside that, her own single sheet of arithmetic. And she walked Judge Harmon through it, the way her mother had walked her through a smoke chart when she was 9 years old, plainly, in order one true thing at a time until the whole picture stood up on its own. She showed him the falling prices quarter by quarter in Caleb's ledger. Then she showed him the identical falling curve in the Keller's books, then Voss's, then Cedar Coulee, then the Petrie widows going back further ending in a foreclosure 2 years gone. 6 independent ranchers, 6 sets of books kept in 6 different hands, none of whom had ever compared their records, because each had believed himself alone in his failing, and every single ledger showing the exact same thing. Beef bought by the Bitterroot Cattle and Land Company at prices that only ever fell in a territory where the price of beef at the mining camps, per Boles's sworn word, and the camp's own contracts only ever rose. A market moves both ends, Your Honor, she said. When times are hard, the buyer pays less, and the seller charges less, and the gap between stays roughly true. But this, she laid her finger on her sheet of arithmetic, this gap only grows. Every quarter for 2 years across 6 ranches, the company paid its ranchers less, and charged the camps more, and pocketed a spread that widened like a wound. That's not a market, sir. A market can't do that. Only a monopoly can do that. A single buyer who's arranged to be the only buyer driving his sellers into debt on purpose, quarter by quarter, so that when their notes come due, they can't pay, and he forecloses and takes the land. She met the judge's eyes. The Petrie place already went that way. Old Amos Petrie sold his beef to Bitterroot at Bitterroot's falling prices until he couldn't pay Bitterroot's note, and Bitterroot took his south section, and the shame of it put him in the ground. His widow's ledgers are on your table, Your Honor. She'd like you to see them. The courtroom had gone very quiet, and now, Eleanor said, the company has called the Rourke note 4 months early on a clause that permits it if the security's being devalued. I'd ask the court to note the peculiarity of that. In the month since I came to the Rourke Ranch, we rebuilt a failed smokehouse, established a proven market at the Deer Lodge diggings, selling cured beef at triple the company's price, and raised the working value of that ranch threefold. The company calls that devaluation. She let it sit. It isn't devaluation, Your Honor. It's the opposite. The company called the note the moment the Rourke Ranch stopped needing the company, the moment it found a way to sell around the monopoly. The clause wasn't invoked because the ranch lost value. It was invoked because the ranch found a way to survive without being robbed. And a ranch that survives can't be foreclosed. And a ranch that can't be foreclosed can't be taken. So the company moved fast before the pattern could be seen. Wow. She squared the ledgers on the table. I'm asking the court to see the pattern. It's all here. 6 families, 2 years, 1 thief. Prewitt was on his feet. Your Honor, this is precisely the sort of wild, unsubstantiated, it's 6 ledgers and a sworn statement, Counselor, Harmon said, not looking at him. That's about the least wild thing I've seen in this court all week. He was turning pages now, Keller's book, then Voss's, then back to the Rourke ledger, his hawk's eyes moving down the columns, and Eleanor watched a federal judge do in 20 minutes what she'd done in 3 sleepless weeks, watched him find the pattern, watched his jaw set. These prices, this spread. Mr. Prewitt, is your client present? Is Mr. Vane in this courtroom? Silas Vane rose from the back, smooth and unbothered. I am, Your Honor, and I'd remind the court that a company buying beef at prices agreed to by willing sellers has broken no law. If these men signed my notes and sold me their beef, they did so freely. Hard times are hard times. It's no crime to be a better man of business than one's neighbors. It's no crime to be a better man of business, Harmon agreed. It is a crime to arrange to be the only buyer and then use that arrangement to drive sellers into manufactured debt for the purpose of seizing their land. That's fraud, Mr. Vane. And if it's systematic, if it's 6 ranches and 2 years and a pattern, a child could read off these pages. It may be conspiracy to defraud. Besides, he set down the ledger. Now, you've filed a foreclosure with this court this morning. Before I rule on it, I find I've got questions about the standing of the company that filed it, and about the note it's built on, and about 5 other notes held by the same company that I'd like to see for myself. So here's what's going to happen. And here the whole thing turned over one last time. The final twist, the one Silas Vane never saw coming because he'd spent his life beating men who fought him one at a time and had never once been fought by all of them at once. I'm staying the Rourke foreclosure, Harmon said, pending a full inquiry into the business practices of the Bitterroot Cattle and Land Company. I'm ordering the company's books, all of them, Mr. Vane, the purchase records and the sales records, and every note you hold in this territory produced to this court within 10 days. And I'm notifying the United States Attorney for the territory. Because if what these ledgers show holds up against your own books, this stops being a foreclosure matter and becomes a federal fraud prosecution. He fixed Vane with a look that stripped the smile clean off. You came into my court this morning to take a man's ranch. You may leave it having lost a good deal more than that. I'd advise you to retain a better lawyer than the one who told me a woman with 6 ledgers was hysterical." It was in that exact moment the words, "I'm staying," the foreclosure still hanging in the air, that the courtroom doors banged open and Caleb Rourke came through them. He was gray with 3 days' dust and swaying on his feet, and there was blood dried at his temple from wherever the chase had taken him. And Duff was behind him holding the doorframe, and Caleb had ridden 2 days, losing 6 of Vane's men down roads to nowhere, and then ridden a 3rd day straight through the dark to keep a promise. And he came through those doors, expecting to find a fight, expecting to be too late, expecting the worst thing a man who'd learned to expect the worst could expect. And instead he found a silent courtroom and a federal judge with 6 ledgers open on his bench, and Silas Vane standing white and stricken in his fine coat, and a small dust-caked woman standing at the rail with her spine straight as a fence rail and her burned hand resting on a stack of books. "Am I?" Caleb's voice cracked. He didn't know what he'd walked into. "Nell, am I too late?" Eleanor turned, and for the first time in the whole long month, through the rotten meat and the burned hand and the ambush in the draw and the 3 nights riding the valley and the courthouse steps, for the first time Eleanor Whitaker's composure broke all at once, clean through, and she pressed her burned hand to her mouth and she said, "No, no, Caleb, you're not too late. You're just in time." And then, because a federal judge was watching, and she could not throw herself across a courtroom, she said the only thing that would hold, "It's done. He's finished. The judge stayed the foreclosure, and he's calling the U.S. attorney, and Silas Vane is finished. You kept your promise, and you're not in a ditch, and it's done." Caleb crossed the courtroom to her past. Vane passed Prewitt, and he did not touch her because there were too many eyes, but he stood close enough that she could feel him shaking with exhaustion, and he looked down at the 6 ledgers and the sworn statement, and this woman who had walked into a room where everyone had given up and given them all a reason not to. And he said low, just for her, "You did it. You actually, a month ago I called you a mouth to feed, and you just took down the richest man in the valley with a bag of other people's account books." He shook his head slow, wondering. "I've never seen anything like you in my life. I don't reckon there's anything else like you in the world." Judge Harmon cleared his throat. "Mr. Rourke, I presume?" The hawk eyes had something almost warm in them now. "Your wife's been making quite an argument on your behalf. Best prepared contesting party I've had in this courtroom in a year of Sundays, and I've had lawyers." He gathered the ledgers with care, a man who respected paper, because he'd seen what paper could do in the right hands. "The foreclosure stayed. Your ranch is safe pending the inquiry, and if these books hold up, and I expect they will, that note of yours won't just be set aside. It'll be evidence in a federal prosecution, and I'd not be surprised if the court finds the debt was never lawfully owed at all. Go home, feed your men, sell your beef. And when the U.S. attorney comes calling for these ledgers and these witnesses, you see that they're all there." He looked at Eleanor. "Especially you, Mrs. Rourke. I'll want you to testify. A jury ought to hear it laid out the way you laid it out. Plainest telling of a crooked scheme I ever heard, and not one wasted word in it." "I'll be there, Your Honor," Eleanor said. Silas Vane was escorted out, not arrested, not yet. The law grinds slower than that, but a man whose books had just been ordered open to a federal court, and whose name had just been handed to the United States Attorney, and every soul in that courtroom watched him go, and understood that whatever Silas Vane had been in that valley a month ago, he would never be again. On his way past the rail, he stopped just for a moment beside Eleanor, and he looked at her with something that was no longer a smile, something closer to a kind of terrible respect. "You should have taken the widower in Missouri," he said quietly. "A woman like you wasted on a mountain ranch." "A woman like me," Eleanor said, "was never going to be wasted anywhere, Mr. Vane. You just never learned to count what I was worth. That's your whole failing when you get down to it. You were always so busy counting money, you never once learned to count people." She held his eyes. "Goodbye, Mr. Vane. I'll see you at the trial." And that was the last word she ever gave him, and it was enough, and he went. They did not ride home that night. They couldn't have. The horses were spent, and so were they. They took 2 rooms at a boarding house on Helena's main street, and Wesley slept 14 hours, and Duff ate 3 suppers, and Eleanor sat on the boarding house porch in the cool of the evening with her boots off, and her burned hand unwrapped for the first time, letting it breathe. And Caleb came and sat beside her, washed now, the blood gone from his temple. And for a long while, neither of them said anything at all, because after a month like that, the quiet was its own kind of feast. Then Caleb said, "You told me something back at the Springs. After Deer Lodge. You said there was a thing you'd tell me when we weren't bleedin'." "I did." "And on the trail before we split, you said you'd tell me on the courthouse steps with Vane finished." "I did say that." "Vane's finished," Caleb said, "and we're not bleedin'. And I got no courthouse steps to offer you, just a boardin' house porch. But I reckon it'll have to do, because I've waited 3 days and a whole month besides, and I don't think I can wait through breakfast." He turned to face her. "So I'm askin', what was the thing, Nell?" Eleanor looked at her hands in her lap, the burned one and the whole one. "You want to know why I stopped you riding down that mountain to kill him?" she said. "The real why. Not the sensible why about the law and the note. The true one." "Yeah, because somewhere in the first 2 weeks, Eleanor said, between the smokehouse and the pantry, and Pettibone singing over his pots, and Wesley carrying my crate without being asked somewhere in there. This stopped being a bargain to me, Caleb. I came up your mountain to be useful, because useful was all I thought I had left to be. I'd been passed hand to hand so long I'd near forgotten I was a person, and not a service. A thing that could be sent for. And I told myself, that's all this was too. Another arrangement, be useful, save the smokehouse. Don't hope for more, because hoping for more is how you get your heart broke. Her voice was steady, but only just. And then you called me a mouth to feed in front of all your men, and I hated you for it. And then 8 days later, you called me your wife in that yard when my hand was burned, and you didn't even notice you'd done it. And I stopped hating you right about then, and it frightened me worse than the ambush did. She made herself look up at him. I stopped you killing him because somewhere in those 2 weeks, I stopped being able to bear the thought of a world with you dead in it, Caleb Rourke. That's the true why. I fell in love with a man who called me a burden over a broken smokehouse and a bag of salt, and I've been terrified of it for 3 weeks and there. Now you know. That was the thing. Caleb was quiet a long moment. A month ago, he said, I'd have told you a man like me had nothing left to give a woman. I buried my father, and I buried my mother before him, and I watched 4 years of everything I built go green in a barrel, and I decided the safe thing, the only thing, was to need nobody and let nobody near, because everything I ever let near me either died or left. He reached over and took her burned hand, so careful, turning it palm up in his. And then a woman got off a wagon and threw rotten beef at my boots and told me every truth I'd been too proud to hear, and near lost this hand pullin' pine out of my fire, and walked under rifle fire for my ranch, and rode the valley 3 nights alone to give 6 broken families back their dignity. And I sat there in that courtroom today, watching you take down the man who'd been slow killing everything I loved, and I understood something. He closed his hand gently around hers. You didn't come to my ranch needin' a place, Nell. Every other soul who ever came to me came needin' something. You came and you made the place worth keepin'. You made me worth keepin'. And I've been a fool and a coward about it for a month, because I was scared that if I let myself love you, I'd lose you like I lost all the rest. And then I watched you ride off up that mountain with my whole future in a saddlebag. And I realized the only way I lose you for certain is by being too much a coward to say it. He drew a breath. So I'm saying it. I love you, Eleanor Whitaker. Not because you saved my ranch, though God knows you did. Because you're the bravest, sharpest, truest thing I ever laid eyes on, and I'd marry you today for real in front of a preacher, if you'll have a hard, proud fool who took a month to learn what he had the day you stepped down off that wagon. Eleanor's eyes were wet, and she let them be. I'll have you, she said. I'll have you, Caleb, but not because you love me either." A laugh broke through the tears. "Because you finally learned to count people. That's the only thing I ever wanted from anybody. To be counted. You count me now. I can see that you do. And a woman can build a whole life on being truly counted by one good man." He kissed her then, on a boarding house porch in Helena, with the evening coming on, a month and a mountain, and a war behind them. And it was not a soft first kiss, and it was not a careful one. It was the kiss of two people who had bled for each other and stopped pretending they hadn't. And when it ended, Eleanor put her forehead against his, and they stayed like that a long while, and neither of them said anything. Because some things are too full for words, and this was one of them. They married in Helena 2 days later, before they rode home in front of a circuit preacher with Wesley and Duff for witnesses, and Judge Harmon himself standing in the back of the little church, because he said he'd developed an interest in how the story came out. And when the preacher said the words, and Caleb slid his mother's ring carried in his pocket the whole month he confessed, since the day she arrived, too proud to offer it onto Eleanor's finger, the whole small church could see that this was no arrangement, no bargain, no marriage of convenience between a failing rancher and a woman with nowhere to go. It was two people who had earned each other the hard way and knew exactly what they were getting. They rode home to the mountain married. And the mountain, when they reached it, was not the dying place Eleanor had walked into a month before, with one crate and a carpetbag. The smokehouse ran cool and true, and Pettibone had a batch curing that he was fierce and proud about. And the men came out into the yard when they saw the riders coming. 22 men fed, now paid, now standing straight, now, and Amos Reed came out ahead of them on a mending leg with his hat already off. And this time, when he took it off, it was not like a man at a graveside. It was like a man welcoming his people home. "Well," he called up the trail, "don't keep an old shot man in suspense. We keep the ranch or not." "We keep it, Amos," Caleb called back. "We keep all of it. Vane's finished. Judge stayed the foreclosure, and there's a federal man comin' for Vane's books, and there won't be a note over this ranch or any ranch on this mountain by the time it's done." He looked at Eleanor beside him. She did it. Walked into a federal courtroom with a bag of ledgers and took the richest man in the valley apart, in front of a judge, without ever raising her voice. The cheer that went up off that yard scattered the birds the same way the miners' cheer had, and Wesley was laughing, and Duff was pounding backs, and Pettibone came running from the cookhouse still holding a spoon, and in the middle of it all, Amos Reed put his hat back on his head and then took it off again deliberately and tipped it to Eleanor Whitaker. Eleanor Rourke, now the way a man tips his hat to someone he has decided all the way down to reckon with. "Ma'am," he said. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Rourke. When you got off that wagon a month back, I took off my hat to you, like a man at a funeral, because I figured you'd walked into a place already dead and didn't know it." His weathered face worked. "I was wrong about which of you was dead. This whole mountain was dead, and you're the one walked in breathin'. I've been ranchin' 50 years, and I never seen the like, and I don't expect I will again. So." He held the hat over his heart. "Thank you. For all of us. For the fed men and the paid men and the ones with their land back. Thank you." Eleanor could not answer that for a moment. Then she said, "You gave me the first true thing anybody gave me on this mountain, Mr. Reed. You told me the salt barrel was your fault when you could have let me think it was somebody else's. A man who'll own his own mistake to a stranger is a man worth working beside. I knew right then this place could be saved, because it still had men in it, honest enough to save." She looked around the yard at all of them fed and standing, and hers now. "We saved it together. Every one of you." I just knew where to point. That evening, when the celebrating had wound down and the men had gone to their bunks full and content, Caleb found Eleanor outside the smokehouse in the last of the light, holding her mother's oldest journal, the one with the worn place on the cover where two women's thumbs had worn it. "I keep thinkin'," she said when he came and stood beside her, "about what my mother told me. That the only knowing worth having is the kind that doesn't die with you." She turned the journal over in her hands. "I was so afraid my whole life that I'd end up like she did the first time. The only one who knew the cure turned out sick into the winter because knowing wasn't the same as being wanted. I thought if I made myself useful enough, indispensable enough, I'd be safe. And I came up here and I did the opposite of what fear told me. I taught everybody everything. I gave the knowing away to every man on this place." She looked up at him. "And that's what saved us in the end. Not that I knew the cure. That 6 other families knew their own books and a quartermaster knew his own contract, and I just walked around getting all the knowing into one room. The knowing was never the power, Caleb. Telling the truth of it out loud together, where a rich man couldn't keep everybody separate and ashamed, that was the power. My mother was right. Knowing that dies with you is just hoarding. Knowing you give away is how a whole mountain gets saved." Caleb put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood together in front of the smokehouse that ran cool and true, watching the pale good smoke climb slow into the evening and drift north, the way it was always meant to. "You were afraid you'd always be seen as a desperate woman with nowhere to go," Caleb said quietly. "You told Wesley that once. I heard you that first night through the kitchen wall. A desperate woman with nowhere to go." He tightened his arm around her. "You want to know what I see when I look at you now, Nell?" "What do you see?" "I see the woman who saved this mountain," Caleb Rourke said. "I see the reason 22 men eat and 6 families kept their land, and a boy named Wesley learned there's always something to be done. I see my wife who came here with 1 crate and turned a dying ranch into the best-known provisions house in the territory, and who is going to grow old right here on this mountain, being counted, truly counted by every soul who knows her for the rest of a long and honored life." He turned her to face him in the failing light. "You didn't come here needing a place, Eleanor. You came here and made this place worth keeping, and made all of us worth keeping, and there is not a person on this mountain or in this territory who will ever again mistake you for anything less than exactly what you are." And Eleanor Whitaker Rourke, who had been passed hand to hand, called a burden and a millstone and a charity case, who had gotten off a wagon a month before, into the smell of a dying place, with nothing to her name but a crate of her dead mother's knowing and a stubborn refusal to disappear. Eleanor stood in the arms of a good man she had earned and who had earned her on a mountain she had saved with her own 2 hands and her own sharp mind, and the plain, hard truth spoken out loud, and she knew, finally and completely, and for the rest of her days, that she was home, that she was wanted, and that she had never once been the desperate woman with nowhere to go. She had always been the only one who could see clearly enough to save them all. And now at last, every last soul on that mountain could see it too.